First of all, here about the first proposal about reducing feed cost is lowering the slaughter weight.
第一个部分呢，我们要降低，尤其是在阉公猪或是肉猪的这一个成本的时候呢，第一个手段呢，当然是可以呢，就是把它的这个屠宰的体重呢是降低啊。
And that's that the FCR increases significantly with age or body weight. If you have, for instance, a piglet that's nursing with a sow, and if you give a milk replacement, FCR is around 1. But if you raise a pig to, let's say, up to 130 kilos, like you did for a while in China, then your FCR is 5.
那么我们知道呢，因为这个猪的这个饲料利用效率或是料肉比的话呢，会随着它年龄呢一直来增加，是显著增加。那如果是像小猪呢，它在母奶这个喂饲的阶段，或者是说我们在人工乳的这个阶段呢，很有可能它的料肉比是1左右。但是呢，如果今天它的体重呢已经增加到130公斤左右的话呢，那么可以比如说以中国的这个例子来看的话呢，那么在130公斤左右的话呢，它的料肉比可能在1比5，要在5左右。OK。
And the main reason is, first of all, that your maintenance requirements increase with your body weight. It's not exactly 1-to-1. It's body weight to the power 0.69. But definitely, the heavier a pig gets, the higher the maintenance requirements are.
那么因为呢，这个维持需求呢会随着体重的增加而增加哈，因为我们一般的这个等于是维持的这个能量需求的话呢，也就是所谓的代谢体重，也就是体重的差不多0.75、0.76次方啊。那所以呢，它这个第一个部分呢，就维持需要是会随着体重越大，然后它就需要越多。OK。
So let's say that maintenance requirements are roughly 1% of body weight. So if you have a pig of 100 kilos that is consuming 3 kilos of feed, 1% or 1 kilo of feed will be needed for maintenance. That's 1/3 of the feed that you feed to the pig that just goes to maintenance.
那么一般来看的话呢，就是说呢，它的这个维持的需要呢，差不多是它体重的这个1%哈。也就是说，如果说一头猪的话呢，100公斤左右，它一天吃3公斤的话呢，那么它维持的需要呢，差不多在1公斤。也就是说呢，它的这个吃的这个进去的东西里面的话呢，有1/3的话呢，是来作为这个维持的需要。Okay.
And the second thing is that the maintenance requirement is also driven by the fat deposition and the protein deposition. And the protein deposition mostly reaches a maximum around 75 kilograms of body weight. So over that, fat deposition is increasing very rapidly.
那么第二个因素的话呢，就为什么要早一点屠宰呢？是因为呢，75公斤左右的话呢，一般是它蛋白质沉积最大的一个时段。那么超过75公斤以上的这个体重的时候呢，那么它的这个蛋白质的沉积呢就会下降，然后呢脂肪的沉积会增加。那么脂肪的这个沉积里面的话呢，因为脂肪它相同体积的话它比较轻，但是呢它耗能会比较大。这个我们再OK。
And then the third thing is that the energy content of fat, of the bow fat, for instance, is 4 times higher than that of muscle. So if you start using all this energy, that excess energy above maintenance, what you give to the pig for fat deposition, in theory, it's even possible that the weight gain is decreasing when the pig is getting fatter.
那么第三个的部分的话呢，就是说呢，刚刚我们讲就是说75公斤以上的话呢，它脂肪的沉积就越来越多因为它生理上的这个变化呢就是这个情况。那么一般的话呢，因为脂肪的这个沉积的所需要的净能的话呢，一般是蛋白质，也就是长肌肉的差不多要4倍。那所以呢，就是多过维持需求的这些能量呢，它如果是长这个脂肪的话呢，它一般的这个能量呢，用来长脂肪的话呢，会只是增重了差不多1/4OK。
So there are basically 2 things that determine the optimal slaughter weight, and that is the weight of the cost of the piglet and the price you can sell the pig for, let's say the pork price. So for instance, when piglet prices are relatively high, it's mostly more advantageous to keep the pigs longer and slaughter them at a higher weight. On the other hand, when the piglet prices are low and of course the pork prices are high, it's in general more advantageous to slaughter at a lower weight.
那么当然了，就是说这一头猪我们是要养大还是养小？要早上市还是要晚上市呢？它的这个受到呢就是小猪价格
Sorry,
跟
the higher weight, Paul. The higher weight, not the lower weight.
跟肉价的这个决定哈。当然，比如说像中国像大陆的话呢，过去这2年呢，它小猪价格非常贵，然后它的猪肉价格也非常贵。那因为小猪价格很贵，所以它必须要养很大的体重，这样来分摊的话呢，它单位的这个小猪的成本才会低。第二个部分呢，因为肉价高，所以肉价高的时候呢，我虽然养大，但是我料肉比差，但是呢，它还是有利。但是呢，如果是小猪的价格是很低的时候，那肉价是很好，还是要养大但是呢，如果是小猪的价格也低，然后肉价也低的时候呢，那就建议呢不要养那么大，就要提早上市。OK。
So right now in the Netherlands, for instance, the price of pork is about 7.5 Chinese yen for 1 kilo, which of course is very low. But on the other hand, the price of the piglets is about 150 Chinese yen for a piglet. So at this moment, for us, it's cheaper to slaughter at a lower weight, especially when feed costs are high.
那么，比如说以荷兰来做例子那现在荷兰的这个肉猪的价格的话呢，就是毛猪的价格差不多在1公斤是在7块半的人民币。那么一头小猪呢，目前是在150块人民币。也就是说呢，这2个呢，肉价跟小猪价格其实都非常低。那又碰上是目前呢，这个荷兰的饲料价格呢又非常高因为现在全球的这个饲料价格都高。那高的饲料成本的时候呢，尤其这个时段里面呢，就不要屠宰太大，就应该呢是要提早上市。OK。
Here's given the technical performance of tempo pigs. That's from Topics then for boars, for gills, and for barrows. And here in this trial, we tried to raise the pigs to higher weights. Normally, we slaughtered them at 125 kilos. So in this case, we took them to a slightly higher weight. So I compare here the performance in the last stage compared to the performance from, let's say, 22 kilograms. That's normally the weight they go to the growing finishing units, 230 kilos.
那么这张表的话呢，主要是托贝克的这个 Tempo 的这个品系的它是把它这个公猪、女猪还有阉公猪呢它们呢3个呢都分别来把它比较呢它的这个饲养的一个成绩那么因为呢它们的这个常态性的屠宰呢是在125公斤左右所以呢它把它做到稍微大一点点，所以呢做到130公斤。所以呢，来看它100公斤到130公斤，或者是说呢，它整集从这一个出保育舍以后呢，到这个小猪等于是生长育肥呢，那么从22公斤到130公斤的这个整个的生长表现的一个成绩情况。OK。
So if you look in the whole phase as a whole from 22 to 130 kilos, then you see in fact that the barrows gained had a higher average daily gain than the gills. But if you look at this phase, just 100 to 130 kilos, you actually see that the gain of the barrels was only slightly higher. So in fact, what you see is that at this higher weight, relatively the gills were gaining more or were doing better. And here at this lower phase here, actually the barrels were doing better.
那么如果是说从22公斤一直做到130公斤，我们可以看到呢， 就是说它的这个燕公猪的整齐的生长速度呢，其实呢它是看起来就是比女猪呢要高很多，比母的这个肉猪的话要高很多。但是呢，如果我们把它看是在100公斤到130公斤这个阶段的话呢，那么它就是1120跟1192克哈，那可以看到呢，这个时段里面呢，它其实呢这个差距呢就缩小哦。但是呢，如果整齐的话呢，它是差不多一天多100克哦。OK。
And also what you see is that the FCR is increasing here from roughly 2.5 to 3.1, 3.2. So you clearly see that at a higher weight, the FCR is increasing because there's more fat deposition, and also that the fat deposition is higher with the barrows than with the gilts. And that's what I mean, that the differences between gilts and bores and barrows also accelerates after 100 kilos.
那么也就可以看到呢，再来看它的这个 FCR 的部分哦。如果是说整齐从22公斤到130公斤的话，那么从2.38、2.52到2.58啊，这个就在2.5左右、2.6。但是呢，如果我们把它算这个100公斤到130公斤，可以看到呢，就是女猪的部分到3.1哈，燕公猪的话到3.18，也就可以看到呢，说越大的猪呢，它维持需要越多，然后它的料肉比呢就越差啊。那这中间的话呢，尤其是在超过100公斤以上的时候呢，公猪跟母猪的这一个整个的料肉比的这个差距或性别的影响就会
So you see, for instance, here with the barrows, they were consuming about 0.3 kilos of feed more per day, and here too. But actually, the gain of these barrows is only slightly higher than that of the gilts. So therefore, here we were already using a little bit of a feed restriction. And if you do not use any feed restriction, I can show you another trial. And there, then you see that the feed consumption of barrows in general is about a half kilo more if you feed them ad lib than gilts.
那么它这边来看的话呢，为什么这个燕公猪的料肉比会比较差呢？也就是说呢，在100公斤以上的时候，因为它的这个脂肪沉积都比较多，但是呢，燕公猪的这个脂肪沉积呢大于女猪哈，所以它维持需要还有它的这个要长脂肪的时候呢，它的料比就会变得很差。那我们再看它的这个采食量呢，那可以看到呢，如果整齐来看，就是差不多差在0.4就是300克哈，2.47跟2.78。等于呢，差不多在300克左右。那么到这一个100到130公斤的时候呢，它3.41跟3.74呢，这3.74呢，如果这个是因为它把它采现式哦，如果不是现式的话呢，一般的话呢，一天的话呢，一头燕公猪的话呢，要比女猪的话要多0.5公斤以上的饲料采食量。OK，
And you see it clearly coming back in the body composition. Here, this is the amount of back fat, which is always higher in barrows. And as a consequence, of course, lean meat is lower. So this difference also in body composition accelerates after 100 kilograms.
那么再来我们看到它的这个被脂厚度也就是它的这个脂肪量这部分可以看到呢，燕公猪的这个脂肪呢也长得比较多。那看它的这个肌肉量或是它的瘦肉量的话呢，那也可以看到它有最低的这个瘦肉量所以这个部分来看，当然就是说等于性别影响尤其在越大的猪呢，它影响越大，在超过130公斤以上的话呢，它影响呢就更大。OK，
That's very interesting. When you would have raised them as boars, you see here overall the gain for the boars was less than, for instance, for gilts or for barrows. But over here in this latter phase, then you see that boars are starting to gain more than the gilts or the barrows. So actually, the boars continue to produce more lean meat. And that's what you see back here with a lower amount of fat and a higher meat percentage. And that's the reason that boars at a higher age gain more than barrows or gilts.
那么我们再来看，也就是说这一头猪如果是公的，但是它没有把它阉，或者是说免疫忌式但主要是没有阉的。如果是它未阉割的这个公猪，你把它养的时候，我们看到它 这个整期来看的平均的日增重的话呢，它是最低的哦，就955克。但是呢，这一头公猪如果它没有阉的话，你可以看到它从100公斤到130公斤的时候呢，它的增重呢反而是最快。也就是这个时段里面的话，如果没有阉的话呢，这一头公猪它的这个瘦肉的增长还会持续在增加哦。所以我们在看它到整期以后的这个屠宰来看的话呢，那么它的背标呢是最薄，那么它的瘦肉率呢是最高的。所以可以看到呢，就是如果没有阉，它性别影响里面如果没有阉的话呢，这公猪的话呢，它后期的这个等于长肉的这个机会呢还是会比较多哦。OK。
Yeah, and therefore FCR here in this phase or in this phase with boars is always much better than with gilts or with barrows.
那么不管是说它这个130公斤到100到130公斤，或者从22公斤到130公斤来看的话呢，都可以看到它的这个公猪，它的这个料肉比的话呢，或是它的饲料利用效率的话还是最好。
And then also interesting is if you look at the muscle thickness, this is just from the loin, then you see in general that it is the gilts who have the highest muscle thickness in the loin. And the reason for it is that boars will deposit more meat in the hams. So if you look for physical appearance, the physical appearance is also different between a gilt and a boar. While the boar will have more developed hams, and a gilt will have a more developed back.
那么我们再来看它的这个里肌哈，就是里肌肉的这个整个的它的这个直径哈，就来看到它的这个整体来看的话呢，阉公猪的这一个里肌哈，就是它的这个背最长肌的话呢，可以看到呢，它整个的反而呢就是它的瘦肉量，或是说它的这个里肌的量呢是比较小。那这一头公猪它主要的这个长肉的话呢，在体型上来讲，如果没有阉的话呢，它就是长到后腿或者长到前腿里面去，长到 ham 里面去。但是呢，母猪的这个女猪来看的话呢，那么它的这个瘦肉的增重啊，有很大部分呢，它是跑到它的这个里肌肉里面去的啊。OK。
I'll show you this slide here because here also temple pigs were fed from 55 to 115 kilograms, but then they were either fat restricted at about 3.2 times maintenance, that is in general the optimal feeding level that we use, or we fed them ad lib. And then again, we did it with gilts, barrows, boars, and then looked at the different performances.
那么这一个呢，一样是用这个 Temple 的这个品系的猪哈，那么它做55公斤到115公斤的时候呢，那它把它限市哈，限市的话呢，等于是一般的话呢是用它的这个维持需要的3.2倍啊，这就是很正常的一般的这个给饲量啊。另外一个呢，就是来做它的这个认识的一个状态的一个比较啊。OK。
What you see here, if you feed the gilts at lip, they were consuming about 2,700 grams of feed per day, which is about the same as when they were fed 3.2 times maintenance. So in fact, what you see is that the gilts are more or less restricting themselves to about 2,700 grams of feed. But if you let the barrows go at lip, you see that they are roughly consuming about half a kilogram more than the gilts were.
那么我们看它有限市跟没限市的这个女猪的这个部分来看的话呢，它的采食量呢，就是维持在2.7公斤左右哈，就是2683跟2743哈，它其实是很趋近的。但是呢，如果是这一头阉公猪，它有把它限市，限在2.7，或者你不把它限市，你们让它认死的时候呢，它这一头公猪，这个阉公猪的话，就吃到3.2公斤去。哎。
And then it's interesting to look at the FCR. Because, for instance, here, when you see here that the barrels were consuming 2,700 grams of feed and they were gaining 1,000 grams, here they were consuming 500 grams more of feed and they only gained 50 grams more. So in fact, the FCR for that last half kilo that you fed to the barrels was 10.
那么我们可以看到哈，这个母猪的话呢，它吃2.7公斤的话呢，它一天的增重呢也在差不多在1040左右哈，就1000多一点。那我们可以看到是阉公猪的话呢，是从现制的2.7公斤，让它认识都跑到3.2公斤，但是它的这个增重的话呢，这个多了0.5公斤的采食呢，只增加多少？多长50克。所以呢，也就是说呢，你如果是多吃的这一些来变成要长肉或是长脂肪来看的话呢，它的料肉比要在10:1左右啊，所以非常不经济。OK，
So the point of it is, if you were having barrows and gilts consume about the same amount of feed, so feed them restricted, you see there was no difference in the amount of back fat, but if you feed them ad lib, then barrows were consuming 500 grams more of feed. Look at the FCR, that went up about a half, and all that extra feed ended up as back fat. So the point of it is, you should feed barrows restricted. In this case, if you calculate it out, roughly 15% of the ad lib feed intake of what the gilts would be doing.
那么所以呢，我们可以看到哈，就是以阉公猪的这个现世的跟它的这个母猪来看，女猪来看的话呢，那么它的这个背标到最后背标的这个厚度哈，就是到115公斤的时候呢，可以看到都12，它其实是就是你把它现世以后，它不会比较肥。但是呢，如果我今天把它做认识的这个情况里面的话呢，阉公猪呢就吃到刚刚讲哈，就吃到3.2公斤，3.2公斤以后呢，它料肉比又变得非常差哈，就是它日增重一样在1070几，但是呢，它的这个料肉比呢就高到2.98啊，多了0.5个这个料肉比，啊，就是饲料利用效率要多高，提高0.5。那我可以看到呢，这中间只要是什么多吃，然后呢就是什么去长油。所以就变成它的这个背标呢特别厚啊，所以可以看到呢，这头阉公猪呢就变成过肥啊。OK。
So that's why it's the point that if you want to reduce feed cost, the best thing to do is that you split the sexes. So feed the barrows from the gilts separately, preferably in separate houses or in separate pens, and then you restrict the boars, and then you feed the gilts ad lib.
那么当然了哈，所以如果是说呢，要减少这个肉猪的这个成本里面来看的话呢，那最好的一个方式呢，就是把它公母分饲哦。那看似要在不同的洞舍或是不同的栏位呢来做公母分饲，那这中间的话呢，可以对阉公猪呢来进行限饲，但是呢，在女猪的部分呢就给它认识，这样的话呢，对它的整个的生产成本的话呢是有很大的一个帮忙啊。OK。
So again, it is the barrows that should consume only about 80% of the feed which it would normally ad lib take. But on the other hand, to accelerate the growth of the gilts, it's better than to have the gilts in separate pens and let them eat ad lib, because the problem is that barrows in general have consumed more feed and are therefore heavier. And if you have them in the same pen, the barrows will compete with the gilts for feed intake, and that restricts the feed intake of the gilts.
那么一般的话呢，如果能够把它公母分饲的时候呢，那么这个阉公猪的话呢，一般当然呢，我们可以把它做限量，也就是说，通常会建议呢，就是它认识量的80%，这样来做限饲的时候呢，那对它的这个整个生长还有它的这个经济效益来看呢，会是比较理想。那母猪的话呢，就应该是采取认识。但是呢，如果没有公母分饲的时候呢，因为我们看到这个阉公猪它会吃的比较多，也长得比较快。那么在前期的这个吃的比较多、长得比较快的过程里面的话呢，如果是群养，它跟公母不分饲的时候呢，那么它的抢食呢就会比较厉害所以呢，它会把这个饲料槽占据，或者是说它采食比较多，那变成了这一个如果是群养的这个母猪的话呢，就变成是什么？就限饲所以这样的话呢。会以后的这个整齐度也不好。那第二个部分呢，母猪的这个生长呢，没有达到最大的一个生长处的这个需求OK。
Yeah, we saw already that barrels tend to deposit more fat, and that's also why it's good to feed barrels then a low energy feed. And on the other hand, we also saw that barrels deposit less protein, and therefore your SID lysine or SID essential amino acid to any ratio can be different too. So in essence, formulate a different feed for barrels than for gills, and it saves you roughly 5% on the feed cost of the barrel feed.
那么前面也可以看到呢，就是说呢，追头风猪、阉公猪的话呢，它会过多的采食，或者是说呢，它本身呢这个蛋白质的沉积呢就是会比较低，然后呢长油会比较多，所以呢，除了公母分饲能够把它做一个量的限制以外的话呢，也可以做这个值的改变也就是说呢，把这个阉公猪的料跟这个女猪的料呢，把它做分别呢做不一样那么一般的话呢，阉公猪的话呢，可以容许比较低的这个净能，或者是比较低的这一个等于它的这一个叫可消化的或者可利用的这个必需氨基酸那一般的话呢，阉公猪料的话呢，一般可以比女猪料来看的话呢，可以节省差不多5% 的这个5个百分比的这个成本
The other thing that I mentioned already is the split sex feeding. You can do it two ways. You can put the barrels in separate pens from the gills in the same house, but then of course you need two feeding lines, and that is in general in practice more difficult. So if you have a larger operation, what is easier is house the barrels in separate houses than in gills. And in that case, you do not have to have two feeding lines in one house. You can just feed a barrel feed to the silos from which you feed the barrels, and a gilt feed to the silos from where you feed the gilts.
那么一般的这个公母分饲的这个情况呢，就可以采取2种如果是说小规模上，它当然是比较不好操作，也就是说它同一洞舍里面，那么不同栏位这个是阉公猪栏，这个是女猪栏。那这个呢，因为要喂2种不同的料所以呢，它需要2个饲料的管线，或者是说2个散装料桶那如果是说我是比较大规模的这个经营来看的时候尤其像在这个一条龙的这个客户来看的话应该是比较好操作也就是用洞来分别这一洞是养阉公猪，这一洞是养这个女猪。那这样的话呢，公母分饲上它就相对呢会比较容易。OK。
The second thing I mentioned is the feed restriction, and of course it's difficult to do in practice still, because how do you know how much feed you need to feed to the gills and to the barrels? And then one way you can do it is, for instance, you give a higher stocking density to the barrels, let's say 110% of what is normal, and lower to the gills, let's say in this case 90% of what you normally use. And in that case, you can also use this stocking density as a way of implementing the feed restriction, which of course means in general that if you have these gilts with a lower stocking density, that they will gain more rapidly. But the disadvantage here with the barrels is that you have less uniformity if they start competing with each other.
那么一般的话呢，当然我们把它公母分饲以后呢，到底阉公猪我要限饲的时候呢，要采取什么样的量来做呢，会比较理想呢？有时候呢比较难计算所以呢也有另外一个实务的话呢，这种管理方式的话呢，就是我如果是公母分饲，把阉公猪跟母猪是分开来养的时候呢，那么我就把阉公猪的这个密度呢，饲养密度呢，就把它提高到110%让它呢。就是这个比较密的这个空间，然后呢，它的这个采食呢就会比较少一点那么它等于呢会长得呢就等于是不会过度采食那么多。那么母猪的话呢，就是女猪的话呢，我们希望用90%的这个密度也就是你可以减少10%的这个密度，因为让它的这个密度低一点的时候呢，它采食量会增加，而且呢它环境压力小，它生长会比较快那这样的话呢，就也可以呢调整整群里面呢以后要上市的这个时间呢，也可以调整的比较好。那这样的来看的话呢， 唯一呢就是如果是燕公猪的这个饲养过密的时候呢，它的整齐度会比较差一点。OK。
And then this separate barrow and gilt feed, if you want to lower the amount of net energy in your barrow feed, of course, the best way to do it is using more byproducts, so you end up with a higher level of fermentable and inert carbohydrates. In our European situation where we have a lot of byproducts available, that is easy. But I realize in Taiwan, where you might not have that many byproducts available, or the byproducts might relatively be too expensive, it's a little bit more difficult.
那么另外呢，就是如果是公母分饲的时候呢，那么燕公猪料呢，一般我们可以给它就是比较低的热能跟静能，或者是说比较低的这个可消化的氨基酸啊。所以它的实际里面的话呢，如果说我们要把它的能量做的比较低，或者是说呢它的这个氨基酸的含量做的稍微低一点的话呢，可以选用了比较多的这个可发酵，或者是说惰性的这个碳水化合物，就是纤维的这个部分啊。但是呢，因为要看地方有的地方的话呢，纤维价格是非常贵的，那就不一定是很适合所以如果来做的时候呢，一般的话呢，如果有很好的这个便宜的纤维来源的话呢，燕公猪料建议呢就是比较低的热能跟比较低的这个可利用的氨基酸OK。
Yeah, so your feed cost, I mentioned earlier, 5%. Sometimes it might be 2% lower, depending on the time that I calculated it. But then the cost per unit of net energy is probably about the same. But then realize you gain it back by having a better body composition. And in general, if you have a better carcass quality, you can obtain a higher price.
那么一般的话呢，就是说，如果是说把这个燕公猪的料呢做的比较低浓度的时候呢，它前面也讲一般可以减差不多绝对成本呢，要减到5%或者是减到2%，就看这个当时的这个所有的料啦，或者是说猪价的这个情况来调但是呢，燕公猪的料是绝对会比这个女猪料或者是一般的这个正常的肉猪料呢可以来的低一点那因为给它的这一些比较低的这一些浓度的话呢，反而呢对它的这一个体组成呢，尤其呢是它的瘦肉率的部分就油的部分呢不会那么多。那这样的话呢，如果是说在可以做土里计价，或者是说呢它在体型上的这个计价的时候呢，那反而呢会比较有利OK。
And then a fourth option or possibility that you have, especially when you raise them in separate houses, is that you can change your slaughter weight, because in essence you can raise the gilts heavier, because we saw already gilts deposit less fat as they age, and then of course you can slaughter the barrows earlier because FCR continues to increase so rapidly when you're older, and in that case you save on the feed cost of the barrows, but on the other hand you can still profit from the high lean growth that the gilts have at a higher weight. And then if you do this in separate houses, the gilts and the barrows, then of course you can clean the houses where you've had the barrows earlier, and in that case optimally use your facilities.
那么当然如果能够真正把它做公母分饲的时候呢，那我们知道呢，因为母猪就刚刚前面看到就母的猪呢，它后面的这个瘦肉增重，还有它的这个整个增重来看的话呢，并不会比较差所以可以呢把女猪或是母猪呢是养大一点。那燕公猪我们知道它因为后期的话呢，它料肉比的话呢，其实是不好所以呢，反而呢就是如果公母分饲的话呢，就把燕公猪呢能够提早上市那如果能够提早上市，它第一个售价也好，第二个部分呢，它真正的生产成本会比较低所以可以让它的这个成本呢是比较低以外呢，那最主要还可以是什么样？一般的燕公猪舍呢，还可以呢就是增加它的这个循环利用这使它的使用率呢能够最高OK。
Then another option, and it's probably not so relevant for Taiwan, but for some European countries it is. And that is that, of course, what you can do is immunocastrate the boars, because again you saw that boars have a lower feed intake and a higher protein deposition than barrows, and the immune castrates, they perform kind of in between boars and barrows.
那么第三种方式的话呢，当然是在欧洲哈，他们现在的话呢，这个公的猪呢是禁止阉割，就肉猪的话呢，公猪是禁止阉割。那禁止阉割的时候呢，所以他们有就是所有采取免疫阉割。那么可能呢，在东方，在台湾的话呢，是不一定是很适合啊。那他们这个免疫阉割的这个公猪呢，它有个好处呢，就是一般它会吃的比较少，而且呢，它瘦肉增重了啊，会比这个阉公猪要好很多啊。那它瘦肉的增长率呢也比较快。那这个整体里面的话呢，它的这个免疫阉割的这个公猪的生长表现就介于是什么？就是没有阉割的这一种完整的公猪跟这个阉公猪之间哦。那么当然尤其呢在后期里面的话呢，它的这个料肉比的话呢不会像阉公猪呢那么差哦。OK。
And of course, these sex differences become more apparent after 50 kilograms of body weight, but normally you keep the groups together as you put them in the grower finisher units. And therefore, the advantage of this is that both with intact boars or immune castrated boars, you can just group them together with the gilts. You do not have to house them separately.
那么一般的话呢，当然我们可以知道，就是性别影响的话呢，在50公斤以后呢，它其实就是慢慢加剧的哦。那如果说今天我是做免疫去势，或者是说呢，像他们有的公猪呢，它就干脆不阉哈，那这个完整的这个公猪的话呢，那么它因为它不会像阉公猪呢，后期的这个采食量呢就越吃越多，然后呢就浪费掉。所以呢，它可以跟女猪呢一起做群养，就是可以呢关在一起来养哦，它之间的这个采食量呢不会差距太大哦，那么整个的瘦肉增重呢也看起来都会比较好。那这个的话呢，也就是说你做免疫阉割或者是说未阉割的公猪的话呢，它就不用去做公母分氏哦。OK。
Yeah, the disadvantage of immune castration is that you need 2 vaccinations. So 1 vaccination to more or less prime it, 6 weeks later, the other vaccination to really get the effect that you prevent the testosterone from, or the androsterone from developing in the balls. And then, of course, you need a certain period before slaughter. So timing of the vaccinations is very important, but also it's costly.
那么免疫阉割的话呢，当然它成本是比较贵，然后一般的话呢，必须要做2次哈。就第一次的话是一个基础免疫，那么第2次的这个施行时间的话呢，一般的话是在第1次的这个施打以后的这个第6周呢，要做第2剂。那第2剂做下去以后的话呢，那么也不能够再离上市的时间太久哦。如果离上市的时间太久呢，它的这个效益呢又慢慢变低哦。所以它的这个主要的话呢，就抑制它的这一个雄性激素，然后呢抑制它的这个睾丸的发展哦。那所以呢，一般的话呢，要看你要上市的体重是要多大，那么再来决定了它哪个时间呢来做这个免疫阉割的这个打针呢会比较适合啊。所以这个要有比较详细的一个规划才可以。OK。
Yeah, and the other problem is that the immune castrated pigs still will have have balls, and therefore probably in Taiwan, in most slaughterhouses, they will not be accepted. And in the Netherlands, in fact, the only way we can work with it if you have online inspection of the boar taint, and in that case, you can separate the stinkers, as we call them, from the non-stinkers, and that of course applies both to the immune castrated pigs as well as the intact boars too.
那么当然哈，可能这个因为即使是做免疫阉割的话呢，它还是会有一点点公猪的这个臭哈，也就是公猪臭的这个味道呢，还是会比较浓哈，所以可能在台湾呢不一定能够接受，但是呢，在荷兰呢，因为它欧洲现在这个动物福利的这个规定呢，它没有办法，所以呢。这些免疫阉割或者是未阉割的公猪的话呢，在屠宰线上呢，他们必须在做线上检查哦，也就是说呢，他必须用这 这个一般的话是铁丝呢是把它烧红，烧红以后呢，直接把它这个肉一穿以后呢，然后呢闻那个铁丝的味道呢，他就知道这个有没有公猪臭啊。那么一般的话呢，如果是有公猪臭的话呢，要把它分开来以后呢，那可能呢是做深加工用会比较多。那如果是说一般的这个市场上来看的话，有公猪臭的这个售价呢都会比较低啊。OK。
And here's a trial where they were comparing boars with the Improvac, so the immune castrated boars, and then the barrows. And then here's what they were feeding: a standard feed, also with 15% higher essential amino acid levels, either for a short period or for the whole period. But let's just look at the standard level, and then you see, for instance, that compared to the barrows, that with the Improvac, the feed intake in this case was only slightly higher, and compared to the boars, of course, the boars had a lower feed intake. And in general, you also see that with the Improvac, they had a higher average daily gain than again the barrows, but not as high as from the boars. And the same way applies to your FCR, which was kind of in between. So you see, Improvac pigs are kind of in between, let's say, boars and barrows in terms of performance.
好，那么这个表的话呢，是主要来比较它有阉没有阉的公猪，或者是说做免疫阉割的公猪，还有呢阉公猪那么它做不同的这一个氨基酸的这个量的时候呢，给它不同氨基酸量的时候呢，它的这一个整个生长的这个比较的情况就是它不管公猪、阉公猪或者是免疫阉割的公猪呢，它给它一个是不是标准的这一个氨基酸的含量的。另外呢，就是它整期或者是说某个特定的时间里面呢，它都给它多增加15%的这个氨基酸的这个含量那么可以看到呢，采食量来看的话呢，那么免疫阉割的这个公猪呢，跟阉公猪的话呢，它的采食量呢就以它的这个标准的这个氨基酸的这个含量来看的话呢，那么它呢几乎呢是比较相近的那但是呢，一般的这个如果没有阉割的公猪的话，它采食量呢是比较低的。那么如果以它的平均日增重来看的话呢，阉公猪是最差的因为阉公猪到后期都长肥油，所以长油的里面来看呢，就是料肉比也差，然后呢长得也比较慢。那如果是免疫阉割的话呢，它的料肉比呢刚好介于是在这一个阉公猪跟这个一般的完整的公猪之间。然后它的增重的话呢，反而是会最好就是它的这个日增重的话呢，是就远比阉公猪好而且呢，跟一般的这个完整的公猪呢也比较相近所以这个可以看到呢，一般也就是免疫阉割的公猪，如果是在它第2针打完以后的话呢，它的采食量呢也是会跟阉公猪一样的是比较快速的增加，但是呢还好是因为它的是什么？它的增重会增加，但是它瘦肉率呢也会比较高一点OK。
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, Paul, let them ask the questions.
是，那么讲到这一边的话，不知道大家有没有什么问题，或者要提出来呢，跟他讨论，或者要想要发问的。
Yeah, you see a P trend like we have, for instance, in the Netherlands, and especially for the German market, they're very attractive because you see with the PE trend really a lot of muscle deposition in the hams, and on the other, on the back, is where you see a lot of the pork chops, let's say, which are a lot larger too. So genetics, of course, is a large influence.
那么这张图呢，当然可以看到这个是比利华的公猪，这个比利华猪
卢总，
比利华品种的猪，
卢总，你上一页好不好？上一页。
OK， Doctor, can you to the last page, last slide? Yes, yes.
那个免疫阉割为什么后面有一个+15的，下面还有一个+15，什么意思
Dr. Fu is asking us about the immunocastrations. The lysine content, they have 15 plus 15.
Yep.
This is double plus.
Yeah, but what they did here is in this trial, either with the, let's say the boars, they were giving them 15% more lysine with the idea like, okay, if we feed more lysine to them, we probably get a higher gain and we get a better meat carcass quality. Of course, they did the same thing therefore with the barrels, but then also with the Improvex. And then the idea was, okay, if we provide 15% extra lysine up to 70 kilograms, or if we also in the period from 70 to 50 for 105 kilos, provide 15% extra lysine there. So let's say for the whole growing period. And will that result in a better carcass quality? And if you, for instance, look here at the average daily gain, you see, or the FCR, you basically see no improvement by giving extra lysine. So the idea was, okay, if you give the Improvac, maybe there is a little bit of a boost in terms of protein deposition or growth performance, and you might need more lysine, and that's not the case.
OK， 好，老师，他是说呢，这个主要的话呢，等于是说原本想是说免疫阉割以后的话呢，它这个公猪呢到后期，它可能呢这个如果说给它这个在更高量的这些氨基酸的话，是不是能够对它日增重是有帮忙嘛？哈，那所以呢，它等于前面的这个加15% 呢，就是到70公斤的之前的话呢，它把它多加15%。那甚至呢，就是到70公斤以后呢，它又再额外再把它多增加15%。那这样来看的话呢，原本是希望说它的这个性别影响里面的话呢，是不是后期里面呢，因为多给它的这些氨基酸呢，能够让它的采食量更低，然后它的这个增重更好。那结果看起来的话呢，免疫阉割以后呢，它就让它趋近于是在跟公猪一样，所以呢。你在额外开始给他的时候呢，他也没有很大帮忙，所以从这个数据来看的话呢，也就是说，他性别里面他真正免疫阉割以后呢，他还是留有像一般公猪的这个生长特色。哎，
他这个15是增加是 lysine 是不是？
就lysine 或是整个的这个，因为他这个讲 ideal protein 的时候呢，他就全面都拉高。
全面都拉高。好，谢谢。
OK。
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then here's the idea of phase feeding. Yeah, normally in the Netherlands in the past we feed one feed, a grower feed from 25 to 45 kilograms, and then from 45 kilograms until slaughter, we feed in the finisher feed. That of course means that you will be overfeeding quite a lot of the amino acids and protein in the finisher phase. So if you go to a third phase, or even if you go to 5 phases, of course, you can feed more precisely. And that's why the idea of precision feeding comes in, meeting the requirements of the animal in each phase. And of course, save a little bit in the feed cost, specifically in the latter phases.
那么他刚刚前面有讲哈，就是他们这个荷兰的话呢，他现在是用很多的这个比利华猪的这个血缘在里面，因为可以看到比利华猪呢，它的这个后腿呢是非常大，而且呢，它的这个整个就是它的这个里肌哈，整个的这个背椎长肌呢，那它的这个瘦肉呢，还有它的这个loin 的话呢，就会比较大，所以就是在荷兰的话呢是还蛮受欢迎的。那么在讲到这个精准喂饲的时候呢，那么也就会谈到呢，就是生长猪跟这个育肥猪里面到底我们是要采2阶段，或者是要3阶段，或是5阶段，那怎么样会比较精准，而且会比较经济有利因为我们的分段越少的时候呢，那么也就是说呢，有可能它后期里面的需求呢不需要那么大的时候呢，它浪费的会比较多。那如果是我们分得越多的阶段的时候呢，那么甚至呢到后面它因为它的这个需求呢没有那么大的时候呢，那应该呢是可以把一些营养浓度呢能够降低所以呢分段多的话呢，看起来是会比较有经济效益OK。
Compare, for instance, here a 3-phase feeding program 25, 45 kilograms, 45, 75 kilograms, and then from 75 to 130 kilograms. Here's, for instance, the average daily feed consumption of a castrate goes from 1.65 to 2 to 2.7, or from a gilt from 159, 205, 248. And realize then that about 40% of the feed is consumed in this phase. So if you split up, go from a 2-phase to a 3-phase feeding program, you can save money in this phase.
好，那么先来看它这个3阶段的这个分式的方法哈，就从25公斤到45公斤是一个阶段，45到75公斤一个阶段，75到130公斤一个阶段啊。那我们可以看到上面这个是阉公猪的话呢，它采食量在每一个阶段里面的话，超 1.65、2.20， 然后到 2.7。好，那如果下面的话是女猪的话呢，是 1.59、2.05 到 2.448哈，这个是在托贝克的这个 Temple 的这个品系的猪来看。那可以看到，就是说，一般如果3段的这个分法的话呢，就从75公斤到130公斤，它其实呢，就是它的这个整齐的饲料采食呢，有40%呢是在这个阶段。哦，那么这个阶段里面，如果能够把它的这个需求哈，因为它的需求是比较低，所以呢，能够把它做比较低浓度的这个饲粮的时候呢，那么它呢是比较有经济效益的啊，其实它是可以比较节省，而且不会浪费的哦。OK。
So you see, for instance, you go down then in your energy, go from 99 to 96 to 91. So altogether, this one is about, let's say, 8% lower in energy than this one. But also your SID lysine to any ratio, you change from 110 to 0.8 to 0.68. And of course, then a lower energy content and a lower energy ratio. If you look at your SID lysine, it goes from 10.9 to 8.5 to 6.2. So this is roughly only 60% of what it is here. And of course, that's why your feed cost savings come in, because you can formulate this feed with a lower energy content, which is cheaper, but also with a lower crude protein content. And of course, with that, your calcium and phosphorus levels, everything you change too.
哦，那么我们就可以看到它这个3阶段的这个分式里面哈，就从它的这个净能的这个配方的需求来看的话呢，推荐的就不一样哈。从第一期里面的 9.9 到 9.6 到 9.1哈，这中间的话呢，等于呢可以降低到差不多在8%哦。那我们可以看到它的这个非常可利用的这个赖氨酸的这个需求的话呢，从 10.9， 然后呢降到 8.5， 然后降到 6.2。这个可以看到的话呢，它几乎呢降了在40%啊，就是只剩下在60%的这个量。那如果是说它的这个跟净能的这个比值哈，也就是说它的这个一般的话呢，这个赖能比啊，就是赖氨酸跟它的这个能量的这个比值呢，也可以看到呢，从 1.1 呢，这个降到 0.68， 也是差不多在60% 左右啊，所以。它的这一个降低不只是它的比例或者是说它的这个氨基酸的需求下降以后呢，它的粗蛋白会下降那么能量也下降。那这样的话呢，那么其他的这些成分虽然也做了这些调整，那么其实呢可以看到呢，它可以节省很多的这个饲料成本的OK。
Here you see in the 3-phase program, you are feeding your grower from 45 to 75 kilogram. If you go to a 5-phase program, then you see you split up this grower in 2 phases. So instead of 45, 75 for your grower, you basically start your grower a little bit earlier, 35 kilos, come from 35 to 55, and then you grower from 55 to 75. Same way with your finisher. Here you feed your finisher from 75 to 130, and here you feed one finisher from 75 to 100 kilograms and another one from 100 kilograms to 130 kilograms. That's how you end up with your 5-phase feeding program.
那么前面的话呢，一般因为从45到75那75到130这个我们把它这个分成这2个阶段。那如果是我们把它改成是在5个阶段的话呢， 那么一般的话呢，就是小猪料的话呢，是可以从25到35公斤哦。那么再来的话呢，就是生长期的这个生长1期哦，生长2期料的话呢，就可以把它的这个从45到75的话呢，再把它等于提早一点点，然后呢，可以把它分成2期啊，所以呢会变成是生长1期、生长2期。那75公斤到130的话呢，又再可以把它分成2期呢，也就是75公斤到100，然后呢100公斤到130公斤啊，那这样子的话呢，就变成是在5个阶段的这个分法啊。OK。
And then what you also see is if you compare it, for instance, here you had a starter, you had an SID lysine of 10.9 and here 850. Now you see you step up a little bit, so your 10.9 is going to be 11.6 here. And then over here, you also are going to have a higher lysine. So you have a higher lysine in the beginning phases. And then, for instance, here in the finish, you had 6.2 for your lysine. And then you see you basically end up also with higher lysine levels here in this finisher phase. So it's more gradual, the change in a reduction in energy, and let's say the reduction in your SID lysine, but also in the beginning phases, when the protein deposition or the potential is higher, you feed slightly more amino acids in order to improve the technical performance.
那么就可以从这个5阶段跟3阶段的这个分法，因为呢它的这个分得越细的时候呢，那我们可以看到它5阶段里面哈，就离氨酸的这个需求呢，从前面的这个10.9哈，就会变成了这个很早期的时候，因为我就让它的这个早期里面呢，就给它更好的营养，所以呢会做到11.6啊，那么它就11.6、9.3、8.0、7.6，然后到6.5，都会比这个3阶段的稍微高一点点。那么热能的话呢，也可以看到呢，它的这个下降呢就比较低一点，然后呢维持比较好的这个等于一个比较好的这个比例哈，稍微高一点点。那这个的作用里面的话呢，如果说分级的越好的时候呢，那么因为它越小的时候，它的这个蛋白质沉积是越大，而且呢它需要的这个氨基酸也越多，所以呢我就可以呢把它符合呢，让它这个早期里面的这个受热的增重能够达到最大哦。那这个呢对它的这个后期来看的话呢，应该它的体型或者它受热力的话呢，还是会稍微好一点。OK。
So altogether, phase feeding is more precision feeding, and like I explained, since you feed more lysine or protein, if you want, in the earlier phases, altogether your intake of lysine or protein is about 3% higher. Nevertheless, by using these different phases, you can save about 1% on feed cost, and that is specifically in the latter phases.
那么通过这个阶段的这个饲喂的话呢，或者阶段饲养的时候呢，它可以让它的这个生长期呢，这个营养或者它的饲喂呢是非常精准那么一般的话呢，是可以根据的这个不同品系的种猪里面的它的这个瘦肉的生长潜力呢，来调整，然后看怎么来喂饲那整个阶段里面呢，因为我们要让它的这个早期里面的话呢，长更多的瘦肉所以呢，它分段多的时候呢，它有个优点，就是说呢，它一般的话呢，它可以调比较高的这一些可消化的这些氨基酸，那让它的这个尤其是可消化的这个离氨酸的这个需求呢，它吃的稍微多一点的时候呢，它早期的这个瘦肉增重都会比较好，但是呢，它早期长得好以后呢，后期里面呢，这个营养下降以后呢，那么反而呢就会让它的整个的饲料的这个费用或是饲料成本的话呢，会降低差不多在1%那这个的话呢，看起来主要的这个饲料的节省呢，因为前面的这些料能各方面的这个氨基酸的这个给比较高浓度的时候呢，它料肉比会比较好，也就是它饲料利用效率会比较好所以这个以前呢，我们在养猪常常讲，就是贵要小不是小小贵就是你这个稍微贵一点点，但是到最后呢，反而是比较便宜。有时候呢，它的这个饲料利用效率比较好一算的时候呢，反而呢这个总成本是会比较低的OK。
And then, yeah, another option is instead of having to formulate 5 different feeds and make 5 different feeds and try to figure out at what time you need to ship those to the farmer, a lot easier is if you formulate 2 feeds, one high in energy, high in protein, one low in energy, and one low in protein. So let's say phase 1 and phase 5. And then you mix these 2 different feeds on the farm by computer in different rations. And in that case, you can make a very sophisticated feeding program where basically every day you're trying to meet exactly the nutrient requirement of the pigs in each house.
那么如果是说我们因为呢要把它做成5阶段料的话呢，它常常要再换料呢，实际上呢是相对呢会比较复杂啊。那以前呢，我想这个傅老师以前呢也常常就跟我们讲哦，最好的方式呢就是把它做成是 A、B 料，就是我 A 料的话呢是做高蛋白、高热能，然后 B 料的话呢是做低热能、低蛋白，还有这个高纤维。那么每一天呢，根据它的这个猪的这个需求里面的话呢，那么在农场里面把 A 料跟 B 料呢，按照不同的比例呢，然后把它混合以后呢，来喂给猪。那这样的话呢，其实呢是非常经济的啊。那而且呢，这等于呢，真正的又可以达到呢很精准的这一个饲喂啊。OK。
Another option is looking at diet concentration.
Okay. Yeah, Dr. Fu have a question.
卢总，你问他欧洲是不是很普遍用这个方法？2个 A、B 料。
Dr. Fu is asking, so how about the 2 types of feeds concept or even the practice is acceptable in Europe or not?
Well, you can do it. You need 2 silos per house that you feed. So your low, let's say you phase 5 feed and you phase 1 feed. And then under the silos, where let's say you got 2 augers running, bringing it together in one bin. And that's where you need by computer, let's say to determine, let's say the auger speed on how much it is pulling from one silo and then another silo. And then when you pull it from that silo under there, that of course is transporting it to the pens in the right ratio. That's of course an expensive system, but for instance at SFR we have used this concept quite a lot for formulating different feeds, let's say with different lysine concentrations and things like that, and it works quite well. The only disadvantage again is it's an expensive feeding system.
But how about the commercial farms? Normally they can accept or even is popular in Europe or not?
No, in the commercial farms, as long as you use an all-in, all-out system and have the pigs of roughly the same age, then just having one silo and different phase feeds is the best option, because on most farms they take a feed delivery every week anyway.
OK， 好，那么傅老师他是因为这个系统呢，它需要的这个饲养设备就饲养系统来看的话，成本是会比较高但是呢，知道是说它可以很精准的这个饲喂。那么一般的话呢，可能在试验中心用的会比较多就比如说像 SFR 呢，它就是等于呢生产顶多就是3种料 ，A 料、B 料、C 料，或是 A 料、B 料。那么它呢主要是因为呢就有2个料仓来了以后呢，它必须呢领料以后呢要再做一个混合以后呢再给饲到这个饲料槽里面去。所以一般的话呢如果是说以这个整个精准喂饲，然后呢又能够负担得起它的这个比较高额的这个饲养设备的这个成本的话呢，当然这个是一个很标准的这个方法。但是呢，在欧洲来看的话呢，因为大部分的猪场呢，目前都是采这一个 统进统出或者全进全出的这个方法。那么一批一批的这个猪呢，因为它比较大批，而且都是在同一个年纪，那一批一批的猪如果是在同一个年纪或者是这个相同的大小的时候呢，那么一般就比较采用的方式呢，就是一种料而已那么一种料的话呢，它这个给它整群的猪来养的话呢，就方便会许就成本也就是给饲的设备成本会比较低，而且也比较方便所以这个是他们的这个用法。那当然呢，我自己在丹麦或在荷兰看呢，因为它现在这个饲喂呢是越来越多。那如果是饲喂的部分呢，就用 AB 料呢，它其实是很多人的就是它因为它就把它拧到它的这个饲料桶里面，然后再加水这种方式呢，其实是在饲喂的系统是比较多的OK。
好，谢谢。
So the idea of it is behind diet concentrations that if the feed intake of the pig is solely based on the caloric consumption, it really doesn't matter what kind of feed you formulate because the pig will eat till it meets its caloric requirement. And then again, if you keep the nutrient calorie concentration the change, you can work within a certain range.
那么当然我们一般在做饲料配方跟它的这个成本的这个考量里面，如果说我今天的这个整群里面，我的猪的这个采食量高低呢，一般只是依照它的这个热能热能高它就吃的少，那热能低就吃的多的时候呢，那么如果是只考虑热能的这个影响的时候呢，那么就可以呢，就把它的这个热能的这个高低值呢来做个调整就可以OK。
So in this case, let's say low energy feeds become of interest when your byproducts are cheap. On the other hand, like it is right now, when the fat prices are very high, then of course the higher nutrient concentration feeds become more expensive. And that is then because you derive more energy from fat and less from, let's say, starch and fermentable carbohydrates. So it depends on the feed cost difference between, let's say, your byproducts and starch, and on the other hand, fat.
那么像这个阶段里面的话呢，因为所有的这个原料都非常贵，尤其呢像油脂或是淀粉的这个价格呢是非常高的所以这个阶段里面，如果是说我们把它做成是比较高浓度的饲料的时候呢，因为它要选用比较多的脂肪或者选用比较多的淀粉的时候呢，这个时段里面呢成本一般会相对贵。所以呢，当谷物原料很贵，或者是说呢这个油脂蛋白是非常贵的时候呢，那当然了我们一般来看的话呢，是希望呢就是选用一些谷物。那但是呢，谷物跟这个纤维里面的话呢，如果说它的这个要做比较低热能或低浓度的时候呢，那么如果能够有比较好的这个纤维来源，比较低价的纤维来源，当然这个时段里面做这个低浓度的饲料是会比较有利的OK。
The other point is, if you make a feed more concentrated, then in that same kilogram, you of course need then also more amino acids, essential amino acids. And that means that if you increase your nutrient concentration, in general, you require higher quality protein sources, either higher levels of amino acids or a higher digestibility of your amino acids. And that means you're driving your feed formulations towards using more soybean meal. And this, of course, in general is expensive.
那么如果是说呢因为我们的这个配方里面呢有一些特殊的这个需求，比如说我必须要做高浓度或者是高氨基酸的这个饲料的时候呢，那么我就必须要选用更多的这些高蛋白的这个产品，或者是说我要选一些合成的氨基酸，或者是说我要选一些高消化率的这个蛋白质的原料的时候，那么它相对的一般的话呢来看的话呢，就会让它的这个饲料配方的这个成本呢叫额外的这个拉高那如果这个在整个的这个高的能量或是高氨基酸的这个需求底下的话呢，那我必须要去选用这些比较好的原料的时候呢，一般呢也会让它的这个配方的总成本呢会拉高OK。
So in essence, what you need to do is optimize your nutrient ratio or your nutrient concentration depending on the market prices. And of course, it will be different in Taiwan than it is in the Netherlands, but over time it will be different too. And yeah, then you need to be willing to, let's say, sell feeds with different nutrient concentrations in order to derive the best price.
那么因为比如说荷兰跟台湾的这个饲料的这个价格或是原料的价格呢就不太一样而且呢畜产品的价格也不太一样那所以呢一般来看的话呢，当然我们知道呢，就可以来看，就是以它的这个最低的成本，还有呢最好的这个表现之间呢必须要依照不同地方呢来做适当的这个优化OK。
So to give you an idea, I formulated here different feeds, anywhere from 2100 kcals of net energy every time, 2.5% more, all the way up to 2525 kcals, but using the same ratio of, let's say, lysine to any, calcium to any, phosphorus, sodium, so that in this case, every step here also the phosphor, the lysine concentration, everything increased with 2.5%.
那么它就依照这个方式也就是说呢，把这个氨基酸或者是说呢，在单位能量里面的这些钙啊、磷啊这些比例呢，都把它固定。那只是呢，在能量呢，把它做一个变化也就是说，比如说它的这个净能呢，从2100。然后呢，每一个间隔呢是增加2.5个百分比所以呢变成2155，然后2201，然后一直到最后把它提高呢是在2525那这个每一个间隔呢都是增加2.5个百分比的这个情况来看它的整个的价格变化的一个情况OK。
So let's say here with 2100 kcals, you ended up with a low starch and sugar level, and of course a high level of NSPs, of fermentable and inert carbohydrates. And then you see that if you start increasing your energy concentration, it's deriving that energy from starch. So let's say the amount of grains increased in your feed formulation and the amount of byproducts decreased. On the other hand, you reach a certain point, and then you see that the fat content is increasing and the starch content is decreasing. So here in this case, it's replacing byproducts with grains, with starch, and here it is replacing grains with fat.
好，那么我们从它的这个配方里面的这个整个来计算呢，它的这个淀粉含量，或者是说呢，它的这个可发酵纤维跟不可发酵纤维就多筋纤维的这个部分，然后它的这个占比的情况从很低的能量的这个时候，可以看到它呢这个淀粉呢是从39，然后呢逐步会增加，从43.2、44.8到45然后再到一定程度以后呢。一定的热能需求以后的话呢，就可以看到呢，它的这一个淀粉的含量的需求呢，淀粉加糖的这个整个的量呢，就反而是下降。那也可以看到呢，它的纤维含量会随着就副产品的这个纤维含量的话呢，会随着它的这一个能量的提升呢，然后它的这个用量呢，就等于呢就占比的话呢，就越来越低。那也就可以表示呢，就是在某一个适当的这个能量底下的时候，低热能变高热能的时候呢，前面的这个阶段的话呢，是用谷物呢来替代这些纤维产品，但是呢，到一定的这个能量的这个需求以后的话呢，反而呢就会转向是什么呢？就是用油脂来替代这一些纤维产品或者是油脂来替代淀粉所以呢，淀粉含量就反而会减少了，然后呢。反而就是脂肪的这个用量呢就越来越高所以这个在配方的这个计算里面的话呢，就有2个转折一个是前面的这个转折里面的话呢，就谷物原料它相对有吸引力的，但到后来这个阶段的话呢，变成油脂是相对有吸引力的OK。
You also see here, of course, with this low energy feed, a lot of protein was derived from the byproducts. So in fact, in general, a low quality protein. But then when I started increasing the nutrient concentration, more and more protein was derived from, let's say, soy, from high quality protein sources. Because from here to here, I increased my nutrient concentration with 20%, but you see the crude protein content is not increased with 20%. And the reason for that, again, is that it's using high quality protein sources, and that drives up the price.
那么可以看到呢，它的这个蛋白质的这个变化哈。那在前面的这个低浓度的这个低热能的这个状态的时候呢，因为它的这个蛋白质呢，大部分都是来自于副产品的这些低的蛋白的这些原料。那但是到一定程度以后，我要做高浓度的高热能的饲养的时候呢，它的高蛋的这个蛋白质呢，也需要呢是比较好消化的，或者比较高品质的这些蛋白质的来源。也就是说，一般来看的话，可能是豆粕的这个选用量呢就会比较多。那前面的话呢是杂粕的选用量比较多。那它的这个能量呢，从2100做到2525哈，就是净能里面的话呢，它提高了差不多20%。但是呢，我们看到它蛋白质的这个变化里面的话呢，并没有增加到20%也就是呢只增加可能在10%几而已所以可以看到呢，就是它后面越高浓度的这个需求里面呢，它就是越好的这个蛋白质需求呢，也就比较越大OK。
Here's calculated the price, and this is then for the Netherlands, of course, euros per megajoule. This is more the average feed, let's say, like we would be feeding in the Netherlands. And then you see if I increase my nutrient concentration with 2.5%, my feed cost roughly increased with 1%. And the same way here again, a roughly 1% increase in feed cost per megajoule of net energy when I increased the nutrient concentration with 2.5%.
那么来可以看到它的这个成本的部分就是每造焦的这个成本就是欧元来计算的话呢，那么上面的话呢可以看到，就是说如果是它打深色的中间的这个区块呢，就是2314呢，就大约是它现在荷兰的这个一般的这个饲料的浓度。那么当它呢，如果是把它的这个热能的营养浓度呢，就提高2.5个百分比从2314提高到2307，或是提高到2420，那每提高2.5个百分比来看的话呢，它的这个饲料每造焦的这个饲料的成本呢，差不多增加多少呢？差不多增加1%也就是说每一个增加2.5个百分比的浓度的话呢，它的每造焦的成本呢，差不多增加是1%。也就是从24.3变成24.58，或是24.58呢变成24.80所以差不多增加1%的这个成本OK。
If I put it in a graph, it might be easier to see. There you see that, of course, feed cost in terms of euros per megajoule are cheapest with the very low energy levels. And again, that will probably be different in your situation, because in Europe in general, byproducts are cheap. We can easily import them. But then you see here a linear increase in cost if I start increasing my energy concentration. So here, for instance, are more the low energy feeds like we feed them normally to, let's say, finisher pigs. And here are the higher energy levels that we feed to starter pigs or grower pigs. But you see that the feed cost here is increasing roughly 1% per 2.5% increase in my nutrient concentration. In your situation, this line might be flat, or if fat prices are very high, this line could be even something like this. It depends on the market.
那么因为荷兰的话呢，它本身呢是可以进口到很好的这一些副料所以呢，它一般的话呢，如果是说他们是低营养浓度的时候，可以看到前面如果是8.8一直到9.2的这个造焦的这个净能的这个情况里面的话呢，它其实是可以非常低成本的那随着呢，就是说它这个浓度呢越来越高的时候呢，那么一般它来计算的话呢，也就是比如说它下面圈的这个的话呢，等于是2200的这个呢，是一般他们使用在这个生长育肥料的 哦。那么如果是在上面这一个的话呢，是一般他们这个小猪料啊，这两个的水平里面呢，可以看到就是说我的营养浓度如果越高的时候呢，当然它后面的这个成本的话呢，也就是直线的这个增加。那一般的比例的话呢，也就是它在荷兰的话呢，一般来看增加2.5个百分比的浓度的话呢，成本是增加超过1%。但是呢，这条线也有可能呢是很平的，也有可能呢是很陡啊。那么这个主要呢是依照各地方的这个原料的价格，还有它当地的市场需求的这个情况啊，会有不同的这个反应啊。那这个是它荷兰里面的相对的这个反应的一个情况啊。OK。
Then, of course, the question is, what is the best nutrient concentration then? From an economical standpoint, you might argue that this is the best one because here you have the lowest feed cost per megajoule of net energy. But of course, there's another problem, and that is if you look over here, of course, you have low energy feeds, but high levels of NSPs, fermentable and inert carbohydrates. And that, in fact, might limit the feed intake capacity of those pigs. And that is in general why we see that if we start using, let's say, PE tram breeds, or if you start raising boars, then in general you have more problems of getting enough feed in the pigs, and then we're using higher energy level. But again, this might be a feed that's more fit for gilts, so you can try to increase the nutrient intake with the gilts, and this is more a feed for barrows, where you try to restrict the feed intake.
那么到底这个饲料成本是哪一个是能够达到最好的这个饲料表现，而且是成本最低呢？那其实呢是比较难决定的哈，因为我们看前面那张表的时候呢，当我做这个低营养浓度的时候，就可以看到它这个副产品用的多，纤维含量都比较高。那纤维含量比较高的时候，如果说我这一头猪它的这个采食量不是很大，或采食没有办法增加很多的时候，它生长一般都不好哦。那么像欧洲的话呢，它现在因为呢是这个免疫阉割，或者是说一般呢没有阉割的公猪，或者是养这个 gilts 的时候呢，那一般它的采食量不会太高，所以呢它一般需要是可能呢是这个图里面的这个上面的这个标准，它可以给它好一点的这个营养浓度，让它呢能够采食到一定量的时候呢，能够达到最好的这个经济的这个生长。但是呢，如果是像阉公猪的这个部分的话呢，那么一般的话，因为反而我们要去把它限制，或是让它这个不要吃太多的时候呢，那么就可以呢是选用这个比较低浓度的，然后高纤维的这个产品哦。那这个的话呢，要看各地方的这一个整体的情况来做适当的这一个调整啊。OK。
喂，刘总，
是，
那个麻烦一下啊，问一下那个欧元的单位是 cent 还是什么？那个欧元的单位是多少？每个100万焦耳的那个单位是什么？然后上一张表有一个 HI 哈，左边的那个纵轴有一个 HI 是代表什么
？Okay, yeah, Doctor, please revert to the last page.
Yeah.
Yes. Dr. Jiang is asking about the units per megajoule euro. That's cent or even it's the dollars of euro. That is the cost. Second one was you also express the HI. What means the HI? Yeah.
The HI, and I was wanting to get to that, so that's good. The HI is the heat increment, and that's the difference between the metabolizable energy and the net energy.
Yes.
And then, of course, you see that the HI, the heat index, so the metabolic heat that is formed during the metabolism of the feed in the pig after it is consumed and absorbed from the small intestine, that it is increasing. However, if you express the heat index in relation to the net energy content, you see in fact that the heat index is decreasing. And the reason for it, of course, is that here in these feeds, you have relative high levels of fermentable carbohydrates, where the energy is coming from, let's say here roughly 15%, but here, for instance, only 27%. So the fermentable carbohydrates give a higher heat index. And the other thing is that crude protein also is giving a higher heat index when, of course, you consider protein as an energy source. So therefore, when you make the feed more concentrated, the heat index per unit of net energy is decreasing.
OK， 好，这个先讲这个 HI 的部分呢，就是 heat increment 啊，也就是热增值的这个部分啊。那因为如果是说在低热能的这个饲养里面的话呢，它会用比较多的这些可发酵纤维跟它的这一个不可发酵纤维啊，尤其是在可发酵纤维里面的话呢，因为我们从代谢能变到净能的这个过程里面的话呢，除了这一个就是等于呢差距呢是差距在这一个heat increment 啊，那热增耗如果是纤维含量越多，尤其可发酵纤维很多的时候呢，它热增耗是会比较高。那这一只猪呢，如果是说尤其是在热的环境里面的话，那么它热增值指标呢就会比较多啊。那我们前面在谈的时候呢，其实要注意，也就是在夏天跟冬天的时候呢，其实纤维原料的选用呢就必须要很注意。当我夏天的热紧迫很大的时候，那我在选用高纤维，尤其是高的这个可发酵纤维的时候呢，我的热增值就很高。这只猪呢就变成非常热，而且它吃不下因为它所产生的热增耗呢，就反而呢热增值呢还需要耗用这种热能呢来去把它消耗掉不能够做它维持需要。但是冬天的时候就不一样当我的这个温度如果低于我的室温带的时候呢，反而就是我必须要让它的热增值指标呢要比较高。我的热增耗如果能够比较高，我能够把这些热增值呢就直接把它利用来做维持体温用所以可以看到，就从低浓度里面的这一个变到高浓度的这个情况里面的话呢，那么它这一个每公斤里面的 HI 的这个 megajoule 的话呢，可以看到呢就是逐步的一直在往上升那这个但是呢，如果是占它的这个净能的这个比例里面的话呢 ，HI 占它净能的比例里面来看的话呢，它比值是在下降。也就是说呢，它的这个抗热紧迫的这一个因素的话呢，就等于是热的这个因素的话呢，就可以呢克服得更好所以反而呢，就是为什么呢，在热应激的热紧迫的这个情况底下呢，需要用高热能那高热能的时候呢，它的这个热的指数呢反而会比较低OK 这个有没有什么
Yeah, so the point of it is, of course, the heat index, the amount of metabolic heat that's produced, is having an impact on the feed intake. So these feeds, especially these ones with a lower heat index, are probably more fit for heat stress conditions because the metabolic heat production is less, and therefore the pig will relatively consume more feed. And if you compare this feed, for instance, to this one, it's only from 0.40 to 0.41, but it's 2.5% lower in the heat index. And this feed, compared to this feed, is having a 5% lower heat index. So in general, what it would mean, under a heat stress condition, with this feed, you might get, in theory, a 5% higher feed intake than with this feed.
OK 那么前面呢其实也就讲过也就是说它的这个热增值的部分呢，它其实是影响到它的采食的那么如果说以它的这个 HI 跟这个 N1 的这个比值呢，从 0.41， 那我增加 2.5% 的时候呢，这个营养浓度就热能增加的时候呢，就变成到 0.4， 这也就是热应激指数。热指数呢就从 0.41 降到 0.40， 在这个呢改善了差不多 2.5%。那如果是说我今天把这个热能呢是降了 2.5 个百分比的时候呢，我的热应激的指数呢，热的指数的话呢，也可以呢会增加到 0.42， 也就是增加了在5个百分比。 所以理论上来讲，如果是在热紧迫的环境底下的时候，我提高2.5个百分比的这个浓度的时候呢，会比这个降低2.5个百分比的浓度的时候呢，这个热能浓度的时候呢，它采食量差不多5%啊，因为这个热增值的这个指标的话呢，就直接影响到它的这个采食量啊。OK。
And the other thing, of course, is in these feeds with high level of NSPs, of fermentable and inert carbohydrates, you get more gut fill, and of course that can lower feed intake too.
那么第二个的话呢，就是低热能的时候呢，因为我们用的比较多的这个可发酵纤维跟不可发酵纤维，那这个呢都会让它的这个肠道呢是比较这个等于是有这个充满的这种感觉啊，所以呢，等于它肠道充满以后呢，它采食量呢以肠脑轴来看的话呢，它采食量会比较低啊，所以呢也会影响它的采食量啊。OK。
On the other hand, in these feeds, you have higher fat levels. So you might think, okay, this feed will lead to more fat deposition, but actually it's probably more these feeds that will lead to a higher fat deposition, because here the starch content is very high. So of course, starch is the glucogenic nutrient, which will also increase insulin levels. So here on these feeds, you will have a higher fatty acid synthesis than on these feeds. And that is in general why these feeds will lead to more fat in the carcass, less lean meat, and these feeds probably give a better carcass quality.
好，那么从它的这个饲料的这个粗脂肪的含量来看它高热能的时候呢，它的脂肪含量是比较高，从6.9甚至做到8.2个百分比，但是呢，可以看到它的淀粉含量呢，从这个43点几的话呢，降到只有38.4或到36.5。那淀粉的这个含量降低，然后脂肪含量高的时候呢，也许我们觉得是说，我这个脂肪含量给它高的时候呢，会不会它的这个猪呢会比较肥，会长得比较太肥，长脂肪会比较多？结果不是因为呢，这个可以看到呢，如果是说它的淀粉加糖的这个含量在这个等于是在2314、2260到2210这中间的话呢，它有到43、44、45的这个等于是淀粉加糖的这个含量的时候呢，那因为呢，淀粉是一个等于呢我们讲的这个就是等于一般的这个葡萄糖合成的葡萄糖新生成的一个刺激因子所以呢，当我的淀粉高的时候呢，会促进它的这个胰岛素会比较高，胰岛素比较高的时候呢，就会促进它的这个脂肪酸的这个合成呢会比较多，所以呢，反而呢最肥的这一个猪呢会出现是在这个中低热能的也就是在中热能或是在中低热能的这个时间里面的话呢，它脂肪的含量呢反而会比较肥。那我们做这个到高热能的时候来看呢，虽然它的这个油脂含量是比较高，但是呢，它的脂肪含量是这个淀粉含量是比较少，或淀粉加糖含量比较少的时候，然后它的这个氨基酸或蛋白质会比较高的时候呢，它反而呢这个阶段里面呢具有最好的这一个瘦肉率或者是它的土里品质OK。
So besides price, there's a lot of other things that you should consider in your feed formulation too. And that's why I formulated here a low energy feed and a high energy feed. And you see here the difference in the energy content is 3.7%, but also realize that in this feed, for instance, also the essential amino acid levels are 3.7% higher. The calcium level is 3.5% higher, as well as the phosphor content.
那么这个呢，你可以来看到呢，就是说呢，以它的这一个本身呢，就高能量跟低能量高浓度跟低浓度的这个饲料的这个比较如果说以它的这个成本来比较的时候呢，可以看到呢，当然它高热能的这个成本呢是会比较高但是呢，以它的这一个净能的这个比例来看，净能的这个每公斤的这个造价或是净能的这个成本来看呢，从 9.5 就变成 9.85， 增加3个百分比。但是这中间因为我油脂的添加的时候呢，反而让它的是什么？ 它的这一个热增值指数就会减少3.7，也就是它采食量呢可以，反而呢，如果是在热应激底下的话呢，它采食量会比较好OK。
So again, although the energy is 3.7% higher, the heat index per unit of net energy per megajoule is actually 3.7% lower. And this is why this feed would be a better feed for, let's say, summer conditions in Taiwan when it is hot, when you're having problems with getting enough feed taken. And this feed with a lower energy content, which is cheaper, would be a better feed for the winter conditions or the colder conditions for as long as they last in Taiwan.
所以可以看到呢，就是说，因为我虽然呢营养浓度增加，但是呢，因为我的这个热增值指数呢是减少。那这个呢，如果说以台湾来看的话，它的这个看法里面呢，就是夏天的时候应该呢是怎么样把营养浓度适度稍微提高以后，然后让它的热增值指数呢是比较低，然后它猪的采食量跟生长会比较好。所以这个高浓度是适合在夏天的。然后呢，低浓度像现在如果环境温度是低的时候，那反而呢是可以多利用这一些热增值呢来做体温的维持。这样的话呢，对它的这个饲料效率呢是有帮忙那这样的成本也比较低，然后呢，它本身的这个生长也不会比较差所以呢，这个是反而它的这个建议里面呢，就是夏天跟冬天的这个料别呢，可以做这一部分的这个调动OK。
And of course, your feedstuff prices will be different. This is the cost per ton as it is in absolute terms. This is the cost per megajoule of net energy. And then, of course, you see if you go from a low energy to a high energy feed cost in absolute sense increased with 4.5%. But if you calculate it per megajoule of net energy, then in fact your feed cost only increase with 0.8%. Nevertheless, this feed is more expensive, and that's why we would recommend during heat stress conditions to use this feed, but then use this feed during the colder periods because simply it's cheaper.
那么前面的这个108.9跟197.4呢，就是它的饲料成本是每吨里面的这个欧元的这个价格那后面这个矿物里面的19.88跟这个20.04是它每100万焦耳就是等于是就一般的这个mega焦等于是兆焦，不是100万焦耳，是每个兆焦就是1000个千焦耳那么这个每兆焦里面的话呢是19.88跟这个20.04是增加0.8个百分比。所以如果是绝对值的话呢，看这饲料成本是增加4.5个百分比，但是呢，这个如果是单位的成本呢，只增加0.8个百分比。所以夏天里面来使用这个高浓度里面的话呢，看起来表观饲料成本是增加，但是呢，它实际上真正的饲料成本呢不会增加太多OK。
You see, for instance, we can formulate both feeds with only about 13%, 13.3, 13.4% crude protein, and it was using the recommendations that I showed you earlier. Nevertheless, you see here differences in the fermentable carbohydrate content. So the reason that this feed is 0.8% higher per unit of megajoule of net energy is, for instance, look at the amount of soybean meal that you use. Here you use more and higher quality protein from soybean meal, the high pro instead of the low pro. And here, for instance, you can use more byproducts. So that's the reason that the feed cost is increasing.
那么虽然它两个的蛋白质呢都是做13.4左右但是呢可以看到呢，就是说它的这个可发酵的纤维的话，从12的降到10.6那这中间的话呢，等于是说呢，我做高浓度的时候呢，我需要是选这个高蛋白豆粉，然后呢不用它这些杂补，比如说像这个棕榈箔，或者是说像这个麸皮或者是说像这个粉头呢，它就不用。那选用的这个部分呢，都是等于是比较好消化的蛋白质，那所以呢，它的这个热增值呢就会比较低那这个 低浓度的时候，热增值是比较高哦。但是这个如果是冬夏里面能够是适度的把它调整的时候呢，那其实呢是非常有利的哦。OK。
Okay, and that opens up the last question, of course, and that is what is then the best level of essential amino acids to net energy that I need, and therefore I want to show some results from this meta-analysis.
好，那么最后一个呢，就来谈一下呢，有关于这个怎么样来做最适当的这些氨基酸的这个含量哈。那么它也有一些大数据的这个分析来看啊。OK。
So here was a grower finisher feed with 14.5% crude protein. You see the starch level and you see the crude fiber level. And here is given then the feed cost. Then either we increased the all the nutrient concentrations with 5%, with 10, or with 15%, or we decreased it with 5, 10, or 15%.
那么这个就是以中间的这个 control 来看的话呢，就是一般我们的这个生长育肥猪的这个料啊，那本身的真蛋白在14.5啊，然后它的这个整个饲料成本呢在等于是一吨在275左右的这个欧元啊。那可以看到呢，它的粗纤维呢是在3.75，然后淀粉呢在46左右的啊。OK。
So you see that if I increased the nutrient concentration with 15%, relatively the feed cost increased with 5%. While on the other hand, when I decreased the nutrient concentration with 15%, feed cost only decreased with 4%. So you always see that making a more concentrated feed is more expensive.
那么当我把这个等于是单位的这个能量里面的这个可消化的、可利用的这些必需氨基酸的量把它提高哦，比如我把它提高15%的时候呢，我的饲料成本的增加了差不多在4.75个百分比。当然，我如果把它降低15个百分比的时候呢，它这个降低的话呢是只有3.88个这个百分比啊，所以可以看到呢，我把浓度提升的时候，一直呢都是会让饲料成本呢是比较高的，就表观成本是会比较高的啊。OK。
And then you see, if you look at the technical performance here, 911 grams. Indeed, when I go to a more concentrated feed, it with a higher level of SID amino acids to net energy content, indeed it increased the average daily gain. So in those terms, you can argue what is the optimal level, because FCR, average daily gain increased and FCR increased, and also my lean meat, for instance, increased slightly. So feeding above this optimal requirements indeed gives you a slight increase in performance, and that is in general why you see that the recommendations, the breeder recommendations, are higher. And indeed, you can see if you follow the breeder recommendations, you can get a slight improvement in average daily gain and FCR. Obviously, if you go lower, then your average daily gain is decreasing and your FCR is increasing.
那么一般来看，就是什么样是一个最适当的一个量？那我们如果这个整个大数据分析来看的话呢，就可以看到，如果说我把它的这个氨基酸含量呢增加超过5%，那么一般的话呢，它 ADG 的话呢，就是日增重的话增加到2%哈 ，FCR 才改善了0.01哦，那也可以看到它的这个瘦肉率的话呢，也是轻微的增加0.19。那看起来的话呢，也就是说呢，一般的这一个最适当的这个需求呢，都会比一般的营养需求呢稍微高一点点，但是呢，会是什么样呢？因为这个因素以后呢，有很多的种猪公司呢。它的这个营养推荐呢，都是会比一般的这个营养需求呢稍微高一点点。如果说我们紧跟着这个等于呢这个种猪公司的这个营养推荐的时候呢，一般是可以得到比较好的生长速率，但是呢饲料成本是会比较高一点点。也就是说，它一般的标准的话呢，都会比一般的这个营养需求的标准呢稍微高一点点。 这个是种猪公司的这个推荐。但是呢，当我把这个营养浓度稍微往下低的时候，往下调的时候呢，就可以看到它其实呢是症状是会变差，然后 FCR 也会变差，然后呢它的这个瘦肉率呢会变低一点。这个是一般的这个情况。所以真正的最适当的营养，可能是在营养需要量呢都增加，差不多在稍微高一点点的时候呢，是它最好的一个表现的情况。OK。
And of course, the question if that's economical, and therefore we calculated here the margins per pig place, and then you see that if you increase your essential amino acid level, if you want your crude protein level, it's in fact costing you money. So although you're getting a slightly higher gain, the increase in feed cost does not compensate for the extra average daily gain and the lower FCR that you're getting.
那么虽然呢，这个我们给它增加这些营养呢，它会让它的增重还有它的这个料品呢都会比较好，但这个瘦肉率也会稍微好一点点，但是呢，它饲料成本呢也会直线拉升所以呢，一般来看的话，如果说我这个饲料成本是很高的时候呢，那么你拉高的时候呢，它反而是入不敷出就反而呢是会还是呢会花比较高的这个成本OK。
In fact, you see that the highest margins were where actually the average daily gain was slightly reduced. So in terms of optimal economical performance, this was the best essential amino acid to net energy ratio, while in terms of growth performance, this was the best one. So again, you need to find the optimum between economical cost and technical performance.
所以如果说以后面的那个部分来看呢，如果是以经济投入的这个产出来看，经济效益来看的话呢，反而是稍微比它的这个标准呢要减低一点点的时候呢，经济收益是最大。但是呢，如果是增加5%的时候呢，可以看到它是生长效益是最大也就是生长效益的话呢，一般是会比它的这个营养需求呢稍微高一点点。但是呢，如果是要最佳经济效益的话呢，就是比它的营养需求稍微低一点点，它的这个收入是最大。那这个呢，当然要衡量各地方的这个原料的价格，还有畜产品的这个售价还有整个的这个各方面的这个经济指标那怎么样能够把它配合起来，然后呢来寻求呢最适当的一个比例OK。
And of course, where the optimal is, I cannot tell you because it depends on your market and your situation, on your feedstuff prices, as well as on your production cost and on your production goals. For instance, in Europe, where there is a lot of emphasis on carcass quality, you might want to go and feed a more expensive feed to come to a higher lean meat percentage. But in your circumstances where you just paid for weight, then of course that would not be advantageous.
那么所以呢前面也一直在谈就是我们到底最佳的经济表现是取决于呢，还是取决于当地的这个市场情况就是我们的这个原料的价格，还有呢我们饲养的这个经济的这个生产的目标比如说像欧洲的话呢，他们现在都是等于呢要求要比较好的这个土体品质。那么如果是要求比较好的土体品质的话呢，他们就是必须要做稍微比较高浓度一点点的时候呢，那么它的土体品质呢会比较理想那这个就要衡量了各地方的这个实际情况，然后呢来决定了要做哪一个营养浓度OK。
So as a conclusion, when it comes down to feed formulation and feeding programs, if you want to save money, well, first of all, I would say remove all additives that are not effective, like NSP enzymes, probiotics, prebiotics, chelated minerals, excessive vitamins. In general, they add a lot of cost to the feed formulation, but really do not contribute anything to the bottom line. You should really look at all these feed additives. What is the return on investment?
那么它做一个很简单结论，如果说我们要真正要求得最低的或者要降低我们这个肉猪的生产的一个成本的话呢第一个部分呢，当然在营养配方里面的话呢 它是建议呢要把这些无效的添加剂比如像猪的话呢，因为像 NSP 酵素的话呢，在猪里面呢，它其实效益是不大的第二个部分呢，像益生菌益生元螯合矿物质还有呢，有很多人会过量添加这个维生素的部分这些呢都可以把它删掉OK。
Second thing, of course, we already discussed this. Look at your nutrient density. And then, especially in Taiwan, where you have a lot of heat stress, you might want to formulate summer and winter feeds.
那么第二个部分呢，当然要决定营养浓度那么这个当然相对于就是我们可以找到的这些脂肪或者是热能，还有这个谷物，还有像副产品的这个相对价格，然后算出比较最佳的这个营养密度。那因为台湾这个我们长期都是在热紧迫的这个情况热紧迫的这个情况底下的话呢，它其实强烈建议夏天跟冬天的这个配方呢，还是要把它分开OK。
What we just discussed, look at your nutrient recommendations, specifically your SID, essential amino acid, to your net energy ratio, because what I often see in Taiwan, for instance, that feeds are over-formulated. So therefore, I can say you can easily save 2.5% to 5% on feed cost if you adhere more to the optimal nutrient recommendations.
那么第三个部分呢，他是觉得呢，因为他跑亚洲的地区呢，他其实跑蛮多的不管中国大陆或是越南或者这边来的，他都会觉得呢，这是我们这边的这个营养浓度呢，都还是偏高所以呢，他会建议呢，我们还是可以适度的把我们的这个氨基酸或是我们的蛋白质含量呢，能够适度再降低一点点。那真正的要把净能的系统使用好以后应该呢至少能够再节省2.5个百分比的以上的这个成本OK。
And then the concept of precision feeding, use more phases where you lower your SID, essential amino acid to net energy ratio more towards the finishing phase. And of course, use different feeds for barrows and kills, especially under your circumstances, split sex feeding.
那么当然呢，也会建议就是要多阶段饲养因为你这个分的阶段越细的时候呢，它其实是越经济的这个尤其呢，像现在这个饲料成本是非常高的阶段了，就建议呢阶段呢要多分一点点，然后它呢可能会比较精准，而且比较经济第二个部分呢，也就是说呢，像公母分饲如果像有很多的这一些契约养殖的或是我们比较大规模的这些客户呢，其实呢应该要慢慢要建议他这个公母分开来饲养。那阉公猪的话呢，还是适合做比较低浓度、低热能的这个饲料。那它呢反而对它的生长不会引起很大的影响，然后反而呢对它的料比呢能够改善很多那这个的话呢相对会有利OK。
And since protein costs are high, of course, you can look for alternative protein sources. And then the ones that we use most is sunflower seed meal and rapeseed meal. In general, for instance, with sunflower seed meal, which we can import from the Ukraine, but you can also import it, for instance, probably in Taiwan from Australia. In general, you only pay about 70% of the cost of high-pro soybean meal, but you get 75% of the crude protein. So in that case, it saves money. For us, rapeseed meal, for instance, is of course something that we can grow in Europe, but canola meal is a good quality protein source that you could import from Canada. In general, maize DHEAS or things like cottonseed, peanut meal, those are not very good alternatives, and I would not advise you to use too much of those.
好，那么另外呢，就是在客户配方成本，尤其在中大猪里面的话，因为蛋白质是主要很高的这个原料的成本来源所以呢，可能呢蛋白质的这个原料替代呢也就相对重要。那一般的话呢，当然像欧洲呢，他们是用很多的这个高蛋白的葵花籽柏那这个从澳大利亚或是从乌克兰那边过来，那等于呢，比如说以荷兰为例它这个葵花籽柏的这个蛋白质呢，是一般高蛋白豆粕的这个70%就是它的价格的话呢是70%左右但是呢，它的这个蛋白质的话呢，其实应该是 高蛋白豆粕的超过75%哦，所以呢，原则上它用的时候呢，当然蛋白质提供就更多，那成本会可以更低。第二个，当然它欧洲呢自己可以种油菜籽啊，或者是说从加拿大的这个双梯的这个油菜籽 Corona 哦，那这个的话呢，也是很好的这个替代来源啊。第三个当然是 DDGS 哦，这个不管是全脂的或者是低脂的它还是有它的利处。但是呢，一般的话呢，肉猪料里面的话呢，棉籽或者是花生薄棉籽薄或是花生薄的话呢，它看起来呢不是很好的这个替代产品那这个部分呢就比较不建议说是大量在使用OK。
So altogether, I would like to conclude that your feed cost per kilogram of pork, so per kilogram of pork, can be reduced up to 5% by using these management as well as feed formulation suggestions that I've been providing. So my challenge up to you, see what you can do. I think you can save 5% on feed cost per kilogram of pork that you produce.
那么如果说依照他前面所谈的也就是我们可以适度的，比如说像做公母分式，然后公母不同的这个饲料，再加上呢有一些原料的这个浓度的这个降低或者提升那第三个部分呢，也就是这一些副产品、副原料的这个使用。那一般来看的话呢，他应该是觉得呢在台湾的话很有机会，应该是饲料成本可以再跌差不多5%左右。就可以再节省5%左右的那这个一定是要衡量各地方的这个实际情况里面然后看怎么样来做一些决定OK。
And with that, I think it's time for a break. I need to go to the bathroom. You probably do, and then we can continue.
Go ahead, take your time. OK. Yeah. 他上个洗手间我们休息一下。那有没有什么问题或者要暂停一下？
吴总，
他
说有没有最新的那个 SFR 的报告或者资料
？SFR 的最新的报告跟资料的话我来找找看，应该有。
因为他说要坚持用他的标准嘛。
对，就 SFR 里面的真正的标准还是在净能的部分我觉得呢，因为我们的原料里面的净能的使用，如果没有很好的一个依据，比如说我们用这个 NRC 的，或者说随便选一个净能的系统来看的话呢，可能有时候的这个精准程度还不是太好。那以前我在天津的话呢，我们经过反复的这样的比较。SFR 的中大猪的一个好处，也就是说呢，它对这些副原料里面的净能掌握呢是特别好，所以呢就可以感觉到呢，就是当我们用它的净能系统的时候呢，有一个很大的好处呢，就是说它的这个副原料的选用呢可以比较大胆一点，而且呢表现不会比较差因为那时候我请苏联做了很多的这个净能比较，利用它的这个净能系统如果使用的好的话呢，一吨的肉猪料的成本呢，在中国大陆那边那时候我们算了，表现不会比较差，而且比较好的话呢，一般每一吨的饲料可以节省差不多在70块到80块的人民币。平均
80块人民币啊？
对，差不多。
早钱啊。
对，那时候这个呢，因为从2011年、2012年、2013年呢，其实我们做了差不多3年的时间比较呢，就是它的这个 SFR 的净能系统，跟一般的这个，比如说我们用代谢能的系统，或者是说呢，我们选用这个 NRC 的净能系统的时候呢，确实是差异蛮大的这个完全就取决于在副料的信心跟使用。
我都没有。
OK。
Yeah, I'm back, but I didn't know if there were any questions or not. Let me know when you want to continue.
OK，傅老师，大家有没有什么问题？
就是说你可以找到新的 SFR 资料吧
我这边可以，这边可以找得到，
谢谢。
OK，Dr. Fu just asking about my experience about the SFR's recommendation or even the feed standard. Since in year 2011, 2012, and 2013, we have spent about 3 years to cooperate with SFR, and then it's running so many tests on Tianjin testing farm. Personally, I prefer, because when we switch or even to focus for use for SFR's net energy system, compared to our originally metabolizable energy system, or even some NE system from NRC. Roughly, I think the per ton of grower or even finished feeds could save around 70 to 80 RMB per ton of feed. Since I think it's SFR's net energy system, especially for some byproduct, is more accurate or even more sensible. Sensible.
Sensitive,
That was, I think, it's a good opportunity. And then there will be a select or then use a little bit more byproducts. But now that means the performance is worse. The performance is better with lower cost, but higher byproduct usage. That will be very costly.
No, again, I think you need not to look for a higher performance, because in general, in Europe, feed costs are very high. So we are more looking at trying to achieve the best FCR than the highest average daily gain. And that was what I was trying to show with this last comparison, for instance. Of course, if you use grower recommendations, breeder recommendations, you can get a better average daily gain, but not necessarily a better economical result. And that's why you should optimize on, and especially right now when pork prices are very low and feedstuff prices relatively high, you really need to look at the lowest FCR, because that's giving you the best feed cost per kilogram of pork that you produce.
Sure, we also face the same problem, because the feed cost now is worldwide.
Right now, yes.
Therefore, now the cost is extremely high. But second one, I think, is here a little bit difference is because the pig or even the live pig price is quite okay. But or even is quite valuable. Quite a high value, since now per kilo will be around 80 or even to 85 NT live pig. But we have the problems. So we would like that the pig, the growth rate is better. That's the first we prefer. Second one, I think, is because in Taiwan we have the live pig auction. Therefore, the live pig, the gears or even the barrow, they should be walk around at the plate. Then they will be auctioned and to decide the price. Therefore, the shape or even the body composition is extremely important, especially barrow price compared to the geared price. Normally will be per kilo will be have more than 5%. I think it's 5% differences. That means each kilo will be at the very beginning it will be around 4 NT's difference per kilo. For barrow is lower than the geared with these numbers. Therefore, how to improve
I gave you the solution. The best way to do it is formulate different feeds for barrows and gilts and house them separately, feed them differently, because you need to restrict the growth of the barrows, because otherwise they will consume too much feed and will become too fat. So you need to separate them in separate pens or in separate houses. That is the easiest. If you feed via silo, if you feed per bag, then of course, you can just put them in different pens. But put them in different pens, with a different stocking density and a different feed. That's the best way to do it.
OK， yeah， 好，那么大家还有没有什么问题？No, therefore we can go on to for the next section.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can upload it again.
Yes.
Which one was it?
Same.
The left one? Venster.
Right one. Right
Yeah.
right side. Yeah. Yes. Okay.
Okay. Something about IGF and growth.
OK， 好，那么接着我们来谈一下，就 IGF-1 跟这个生长的关系啊。OK。
First of all, what is Lianol? Well, Lianol comes from potato protein fermentation. Let me get my pointer on, let's say, where is it again? Pointer.
No, yeah, this one.
Here, there it is. Okay, it's a byproduct from or a product from protein fermentation, but of course it's not about the potato protein. It's a specific bacteria that's used in it, and that's producing a phytohormone. And phytohormones, you have to think about it the same way as in a plant. In a plant, you need cell division and proliferation of, for instance, the roots, so that nutrients can be absorbed in it. And that's the same way you see with the Lianol, the strong effect on gut health, and it is how it is promoting gut health. And in that way, of course, you can get an increase in growth. So Lianol is a phytohormone.
好，那么我们来谈一下，就是利安诺哦，就是利尔诺哦。利尔诺的这个产品，主要我们之前也谈了，它就是以这个黄豆这个马铃薯蛋白哦，经过特殊的这个菌种呢，然后去发酵以后的一个天然的植物性的一个激素啊。那么它呢，这个吃进去以后的话呢，最主要是能 IGF-1 的话，主要来刺激它的这个细胞分裂跟增殖哦。那尤其呢。目前来看的话呢，可以知道，就是我们吃进去的这些植物性的荷尔蒙以后呢，那么它的这个细胞分裂跟增殖以后的话呢，可以促进它的肠道健康呢，有很好的这个关系哦。所以呢，因为它的这个肠道如果一健康以后呢，它的生长健康各方面的表现呢就会比较好哦。所以呢，我们来谈谈这个部分的工作哦。OK。
The mode of action is that the phytohormone is either binding to the insulin receptors and in that way stimulating IGF-1 production, or that it is directly binding to the IGF-1 receptors and in that way stimulating an IGF-1 response. And that's why I'll focus a lot on IGF-1 in this presentation.
那么这个利安诺的这个产品吃进去以后呢，它本身呢会跟两个地方结合，一个呢就是跟这一个胰岛素的这一个受体做结合。那胰岛素的这个受体结合以后的话呢，它可以促进了这个整个的这个生长荷尔蒙或者是说呢 IGF-1 的这个分泌。第二个部分呢，它直接跟这个 IGF-1 的这个受体结合。那么让它的这个肝脏里面呢，就能够有更多的这些 IGF-1，然后呢，产生了它的这一个刚刚所讲的这个细胞分裂或增殖的这些效用出来。OK。
What I want to show you during this presentation, of course, is that IGF-1 is not something that's standing by itself. No, IGF-1 is involved in a whole cascade of other hormonal secretions and interactions. For instance, with growth hormone, if you talk about growth with luteinizing hormone, if you talk about fertility, it's involved with insulin, it's involved with serotonin, which for instance having an influence on well-being, etc. So you need to take the total concept in consideration of the hormone physiology.
那么我们在谈这个 IGF-1 的时候呢，它其实呢并不是只有单谈这个植物性的荷尔蒙，或是谈这个 IGF-1 类这个胰岛素的这个生长因子，它其实呢应该是整个的这个防应激联的这个其他的这个激素的这个分泌跟交互作用啊，所以呢，它跟这个生长激素有关系，跟这个黄体激素有关系哈，跟这个胰岛素有关系，跟血清素的这些的都有关系，所以呢，应该是整个的这个荷尔蒙的这个系统里面来考量。OK。
What I will specifically focus on during this presentation is the effect of IGF-1 on gut health, and I'll show that, for instance, with some results from intrauterine growth restricted piglets, and also with some different feeding trials where protein restriction was used. And then you see also the effect of IGF-1 on cell membrane integrity, or if you want, preventing leaky gut, and on the immune response, the gut-associated lymphoid tissue system.
那么今天里面的话呢，它主要来谈的话呢，就是谈这个 IGF-1 跟这个几个特殊的影响，尤其是跟肠道的这个健康还有免疫反应的啊。那么这中间的话，我们会谈到呢，比如说这个IUG 也就是这个宫内生长迟滞的这些小猪的这个情况。然后呢，看它呢，就是主要是因为它 IGF-1 的这个不足呢，才引起的这些反应。那可以看到呢，它有一些变化啊，所以呢，我们会谈到呢这个IGF-1 跟它的这个细胞的这个完整性，还有呢它的这个跟免疫的这些反应啊，就是整个呢它的这个免疫的机制里面的话呢，那淋巴的系统里面怎么样来做这些反应啊 ？OK。
Because IGF-1 is homolog to insulin, or meaning that the structure resembles insulin, therefore it can bind on the insulin receptors, which means it's directly involved in the energy metabolism. It's the carbohydrate, fat, and protein metabolism. And that's why you see the strong influence basically on FCR, more on FCR than on growth in the trials that Adol has performed.
那么这个因为 IGF-1 呢，它等于是跟胰岛素是同源的哦，所以呢跟胰岛素同源以后呢，所以呢它直接呢会跟胰岛素的受体结合。那跟胰岛素的受体结合，我们知道呢，所以胰岛素的受体结合以后呢，它胰岛素主要是在能量的释放，尤其呢是有很多的不管是碳水化合物、脂肪或是蛋白质的代谢，所以它对这一个能量的释放、能量的代谢呢特别有帮忙，所以呢。它本身第一个很大的帮忙是什么？就是饲料利用效率的这个改善，所以 FCR 的改善呢，它可以非常明显哦。那这个的话呢，从阿豆的这个提供的这个产品的很多的试验里面都可以印证出来。OK。
Growth, of course, is mediated, or protein deposition specifically is more mediated by growth hormone and insulin. And that's, for instance, while I will also show you the trials where nutrient intake was restricted, let's say protein levels were restricted in the feed, because again, this feeding level is determining growth hormone and insulin levels too. And that's also why I want to emphasize, for instance, the effect of the lactation feed intake, because of course the higher the nutrient intake is, the higher the growth hormone and insulin levels will be during the lactation period.
那么第二个呢是跟生长就是等于 IGF-1 跟生长的这个关系那么这当然呢关系到它呢是主要是两个部分一个是生长荷尔蒙。就 growth hormone， 跟另外一个呢，就是跟 insulin 就是跟这个胰岛素它这个因为我们也知道，因为胰岛素它不只是在能量的代谢，它跟蛋白质的合成呢，它也有相对的这些关系那尤其呢，当我们知道呢，就是如果说这一只猪它的这个蛋白质摄取不足的时候，有限制的时候呢，那么它一般的它的这个胰岛素或者是说它 IGF-1 的量呢也就低。也就低的时候，如果是我们把它提供我们的这个可以促进它 IGF-1 分泌的这个东西的时候，那么它对它的生长还有生长荷尔蒙的这个整个的刺激呢，它是有帮忙的所以这个中间里面呢，尤其我们会谈到呢，像一般的泌乳母猪，因为泌乳母猪里面的话呢， 一般它需要的泌乳的这个需求呢是非常大，但是呢都介于呢是怎么样，蛋白质或是能量呢是比较不足的，所以会产生体损啊，就是体重损失的。那这个阶段里面，如果把它补充这个 IGF-1 下去以后呢，那么让它呢可以不止它的这个泌奶，还有它的这个整个生产呢，可以都获得很大改善哦。那这个部分呢，最主要呢，我们也看看这一个部分的这个影响啊。OK。
IGF-1 is, of course, having an influence on milk production, and milk production itself is, of course, important for trying to increase weaning weight. But what I also want to show you during the presentation is, of course, that via the milk, IGF-1 from the sow can be given to the piglet, and in that way it can stimulate the gut development in the suckling piglet, which ultimately, of course, affects the performance of the piglet after weaning too.
那么再来就看它的这个产乳量哈，因为我们知道呢，这个整个的蛋白质形成好以后呢，它这个泌奶量是会增加，泌奶量增加以后呢，当然使用这个Lianol或者 IGF-1 的这个产品以后的话呢，它小猪的因为泌奶量的这个增加以后呢，断奶体重会增加，啊，那这个中间里面的话呢，主要我们来谈谈的，也就是说呢。还有一个就是我的乳量如果比较足的时候呢，从牛奶就是它的奶里面呢传给小猪的这一个 IGF-1 的量呢就会比较多，啊，就是奶里面它还是含有这个产品这个 IGF-1。那 IGF-1 如果它这个早期的这个喝的奶比较多的时候呢，它 IGF-1 量就会比较多。IGF-1 量比较多的时候呢，它肠道发育就会比较好，哦，所以这样的这个小猪呢，以后就会长得比较好，而且比较健康。哦 ，OK。
And IGF-1 is also influencing the maturation of the egg cells, which is of course already starting during the lactation period. And because of the effect on the maturation of the egg cells, it will have an impact on embryonic death losses, which can result, of course, in an increased amount of an increase in the litter size in the next cycle. As of course, also it can have an influence on, for instance, non-returns, weaning estrus interval, etc.
那么另外一个呢，就是说 IGF-1 呢，它当然呢，可以促进这个卵的生长跟卵的这个整个发育哈，所以呢一方面可以让这个卵子的发育会比较好，比较大，然后呢它能够比较好的这个受精。受精以后的话呢，它因为它卵子的这个发育比较大、比较好以后呢，它的这个整个的等于是胚胎的终止或是胚胎死亡呢就会比较少。所以呢它有这个优点以后呢，也就可以让它的这个下一窝里面的这个子珠子的窝仔数呢就可以增加哦。所以呢，它不仅让它的发情的，就是卵子比较大，发情增厚比较明显，然后它配种比较容易。那配种比较容易以后呢，它因为它的卵子比较大，所以它发育出来的胚胎比较大、比较壮，比较大、比较壮的这个胚胎以后呢，它的成活率就比较高，所以呢，它的死亡率就比较少，所以呢，它可以增加它的窝子数啊。OK。
So a little bit about the physiology of the different hormones. Realize, for instance, that growth hormone is first of all produced via the hypothalamus. Here the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So it is the hypothalamus, for instance, that produces the growth hormone releasing hormone, which again goes to the pituitary gland then that produces the growth hormone.
那么我们来知道呢，就是跟生长里面有关系的，主要的呢，就是可能是生长荷尔蒙啊。那么生长荷尔蒙的这个生长激素的话呢，它主要的这个分泌的这个情况呢，是因为从夏至秋呢，从分泌的这一个生长激素的这个释放激素，那么刺激到这个脑下垂，脑下垂呢再产生这个生长激素哦，然后呢再分泌出来啊。OK。
And here you see different feedback mechanisms come in because, for instance, somatostatin is having an influence again on the hypothalamus too. So when growth hormone levels goes up, somatostatin levels goes up, and that inhibits, for instance, the release of this growth hormone releasing hormone. In this way, the hormone levels in the bodies are maintained within a narrow range.
那么当然我们知道呢，因为在荷尔蒙来看的话呢，它有很多的负反馈的作用啊，所以当我的血液或是身体里面的这个生长荷尔蒙到一定程度的时候呢，那么它呢就会开始呢会产生的这个叫生长激素啊，生长激素的这个抑制素。那生长抑制因素的抑制素以后呢，又刺激回到它的这个脑下垂，然后呢就让等于是脑下垂以后呢，下视丘拿到脑下垂以后呢，让它的这一个整个生长激素的分泌呢又会减少，所以呢，这个反馈的这个激素也就影响到，就是控制到它的这个荷尔蒙呢，在体内里面呢，它是维持的一个很小的这个变化量。OK。
Same way, for instance, ghrelin, which is involved in feed intake. When feed intake is increasing, the stomach is more stretched, and a neurohormone ghrelin is released, which again is influencing or decreasing effect growth hormone production.
那么另外一个呢，当然就是这个饥饿素哈。饥饿素的话呢，当然我们在这个胃如果是排空的这个情况里面的话呢，它就会刺激到这个脑下垂体里面呢，等于要多分泌这个生长激素，然后呢，它又会分泌这个饥饿素，然后让它这个感觉饿。但是呢，当它的这个胃如果撑满以后呢，它又会有一个负反馈的话呢，就让它的这一个整个的这个饥饿素的这个分泌呢就会比较降低哈，然后它的这个生长激素的这个量也会稍微低一点点。OK。
So in the same way, ghrelin is the satiety hormone, but then further in the small intestine, for instance, when nutrients, specifically glucose, is absorbed, of course, insulin levels goes up, and that stimulates again growth hormone production. So you see the interaction between many different hormones.
那么这个饥饿素主要是控制在胃的这个阶段里面哈，那么在接下来胃下面的话是肠道哈，肠道的话呢，主要的话是因素林的这个控制哈。当这个吃进去以后呢，就葡萄糖会比较多，葡萄糖比较多的时候，肠道里面葡萄糖比较多的时候，就刺激它的这个胰岛素的分泌，胰岛素的分泌以后呢，就刺激到它脑下垂以后呢，又要分泌比较多的这个生长激素啊，所以一般的话呢，我们要这个胰岛素比较好的时候，那生长激素比较多，然后它本身呢，这个蛋白质合成呢也会比较多哦。OK。
So you see where IGF-1 comes in, when growth hormone is released and growth hormone levels increase, then the liver starts to produce more IGF-1, and this IGF-1, for instance, is involved in bone development, is involved in muscle development, and of course also involved in the nutrient transportation to the cells, and therefore, for instance, is having a strong influence on cell proliferation and cell growth, for instance, in the gut.
那么当我们知道呢，就是说它这个当一刺激到它的这个生长荷尔蒙分泌比较多的时候呢，那么它到肝脏吸收。肝脏如果碰到它的这个生长荷尔蒙比较多的时候呢，然后肝脏就大量分泌这个 IGF-1 然后肝脏产生的这个 IGF-1 以后的话呢，就 IGF-1 再来主导生长荷尔蒙里面的后续的这些影响，也就是骨骼的增长、肌肉的增长跟这个细胞的分裂，或者是说细胞的增生跟分裂。那么这中间的话呢，尤其是关系到就比如说是营养分的运送，或是肠道的这一个整个的健康。这个呢都会是受到 IGF-1 的这个控制的。OK。
I won't go through this whole thing because it's too long. But basically, what IGF-1 is doing, it is binding, for instance, to insulin receptors, and by binding to insulin receptors, it can change the genetic expression of in the cell of making different enzymes involved in energy and protein deposition. So that's why I'll show a lot of results on the mRNA expression in the cells as it is influenced by IGF-1.
那么IGF-1 当然它跟生长是有很多的这些作用机制。那么最主要里面呢，它要来谈的话呢，就是说因为 IGF-1 它会跟这个insulin 的这个 receptor 就是胰岛素的受体结合。那我们知道呢，就是胰岛素呢，它控制的这一个整个的代谢跟很多的这一些糖类或者是说蛋白质的这些形成或沉积的这个部分。那 IGF-1 跟这个葡萄糖，这个跟 insulin 的这个 receptor 结合以后呢，它能够会让它的这个能量的转换到细胞里面的话呢，就会产生很多的这一个酶的这个变化，那么它能够让细胞里面的这个很多的这一些因为要去做蛋白质的这个沉积，或是做其他的这些合成的作用里面，它必须形成很多的酶。那这些酶的这个作用里面的话呢，它就对代谢呢就有很大的这个帮忙那主要他会来谈这个部分的工作。OK。
Here's some recent research from China. So you see that this is really a new research field where a lot of researchers are focusing on. And what you did, for instance, look at the different hormone levels when you restrict the feed intake to piglets, for instance, and then again looking at the realimentation phase.
那么这个是一个中国大陆的这个很新的这个研究就今年的这个研究里面来看它其实中国大陆现在在做这个部分的研究呢，它非常多的。那可以看到呢，就是说在这个肉猪里面，在现世的阶段，一直到后来呢，他把它这个再补回来的时候呢，那给他很正常的这个饮食的时候呢，那等于是在现世的这个阶段跟不现世的这个阶段里面呢，所有的这一个整个的下视丘跟脑下垂的这个生长荷尔蒙跟 IGF-1 的这个变化的情况
So what you find a lot in the literature when we're looking at the interaction and the regulation between the different hormones, then we talk about the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, liver axis or interaction.
那么在这中间里面呢，当然就会看到有很多的这一些荷尔蒙的这个交互的这个作用里面那最主要的话呢，就从里面的话呢，我们会关心到就是说这个肠跟脑这个还有肝脏之间的这个我们叫这个 IGF-1 轴的这个部分，或者是生长激素轴的这个部分的一个变化，就是从脑，然后到肝脏，然后呢到它的这个血液里面的这个还有肠道里面的这个整体的变化OK。
And what is important then is not only looking at, let's say, growth hormone releasing hormone, but also looking at the growth hormone releasing hormone receptors. And in the same way with somatotropin, somatotropin needs to bind to somatotropin receptors in order to be effective. And it's the same way with IGF-1. IGF-1 needs to bind to IGF-1 receptors and growth hormone to growth hormone receptors in order to be effective. So those two things you need to be take in consideration, not only plasma levels of hormones, but also the concentration and the level of receptors on the different organs.
那么从这一个报告里面的话呢，其实我们有一些新的发现，或者说新的这个感觉呢。以前我们只是谈到就荷尔蒙的量，就是我生长激素的荷尔蒙，或者是生长激素抑制素的这个荷尔蒙，或者我是 IGF-1 的这个整个的含量。那其实呢，真正的你有这个量里面呢，还有一个要很大的作用性，就是什么，都是需要它的受体比如说这个生长激素的释放激素的受体这个 GHRH 的这个 receptor， 那你没有这个受体的话呢，你这个生长激素促进素的它就没有办法作用那么抑制素一样就 SSR 就出来，它还是要一个 receptor 这个 IGF-1 一样 ，IGF-1 还要一个 IGF-1 的 receptor 才有功能。那如果没有这些受体来结合的时候呢，就产生不了功能OK。
So what you showed, for instance, is that in its restricted phase, growth hormone levels, plasma growth hormone levels are up, but on the liver, the growth hormone receptors are decreased, and therefore IGF-1 production is decreased by the liver.
好，那我们看到在现世的时候呢，其实血液里面的生长激素呢是增加的。但是生长激素增加就不代表是说它生长激素的这个作用就可以影响出来因为在饥饿的这个情况或现世的情况里面的话呢，虽然我血液的这个生长激素是增加，但是呢，我的这个肝脏里面的生长激素的受体 growth hormone 的 receptor 呢是下降。那所以呢，我没有办法去结合很多的这个生长激素在我的肝脏里面的时候呢，我的 IGF-1 的生产量呢就下降。所以 IGF-1 的这个生产量下降以后呢，就是肝脏里面呢，就因为 growth hormone 的 receptor 很少，那 growth hormone 没有的话呢，它 IGF-1 的这个生产呢，就肝脏里面的生产量就下降。OK。
And then you see higher levels of growth hormone, but you see lower levels of IGF-1 because the liver is producing less IGF-1 and therefore growth is reduced.
那么因为这个虽然呢是血液里面的生长激素是多的，但是肝脏里面生产出来的 IGF-1 是少的，所以 IGF-1 一少以后呢，在现实的情况里面呢，就让它的肌肉的生成还有沉积呢，这个蛋白质沉积呢就下降，就反而呢就长得不好。OK。
On the other hand, during the realimentation phase, it is the growth hormone receptors that are increased in the liver, and as a consequence, IGF-1 levels are increased, and this high IGF-1 then will increase protein deposition.
好，那么恢复到正常的这一个情况的这个时期的时候呢，可以看到它血液里面的这个 growth hormone 的量虽然是下降了，但是呢，它肝脏里面这个growth hormone 的 receptor 呢是增加的，所以呢，它肝脏里面能够结合比较多的这一些生长激素，生长激素结合以后呢，就让它肝脏里面呢就产生比较多的这个 IGF-1，那这些 IGF-1 呢在跑到这个身体的各部分里面去的时候呢，就可以让它 IGF-1 里面的影响就是表达出来，所以呢，它的生长就会更好，肌肉的沉积呢就会比较多。OK。
So although you see a higher growth here, a higher protein deposition during this realimentation phase, actually the growth hormone levels are decreased because all this growth hormone is bound to the growth hormone receptors. And that is the reason that growth hormone levels are lower. So you see here higher levels of IGF-1, but lower levels of growth hormone. And that latter, of course, lower levels of growth hormone, you would not have expected during this phase.
那么这个阶段里面，为什么我们会感觉上它的这个 growth hormone 是比较低呢？是主要是因为 growth hormone 的这个 receptor 呢，在肝脏里面呢，它是会比较旺盛，就是生长的这个的表达比较好，所以呢，大部分里面血液的这个 growth hormone 呢，就被这一个等于是 growth hormone 的 receptor 呢，就把它结合起来。结合起来以后呢，就让它血液里面的值下降。但是呢，这一些 growth hormone 呢，它一结合到它受体以后呢，就在肝脏里面呢，促进它的这个 IGF-1 的这个分泌。所以呢，可以看到在正常时期里面呢，虽然它的血液里面的生长激素是稍微低一点点，但是呢，它 IGF-1 是增加的，然后它的蛋白质的沉积还有生长是增加的。OK。
So again, what you did is in the period from 10 to 25 kilos or for 30 days, he either fed an antibiotic, or not an antibiotic, or he fed a restricted amount of protein or a normal protein during this period. And then he looked at the expression in the liver of the different mRNA expressions for these different hormones, as well as in the skeletal muscle.
那么我们来看它，就是在现世跟这个正常的这个情况底下的时候呢，那么它的这一个等于呢，它肝脏跟肌肉里面的这一些等于是 mRNA 的这个表现哈。那么这个中间的话呢，没有使用这个antibiotic， 然后呢也没有用这个一般的这个 protein 的这个部分啊。那还有用跟没用的这些比较里面来看的话呢，看它的这个 mRNA 的这个表现的一个情况啊。OK。
Great. So let's just focus on not feeding the antibiotic and either the restricted protein or the normal protein. And then you see, for instance, in the liver, like I was explaining earlier, that when you restrict the amount of protein, the growth hormone receptors are decreased. As a consequence, IGF-1 levels are decreased, although the liver tries to respond to it by making more IGF-1 receptors. But again, as long as the growth hormone receptors are low, the IGF-1 production will be decreased in the liver.
那么我们可以看到哈，就是第一个部分呢是没有这个 antibiotic， 然后呢也没有这个蛋白质的限制的，然后第二个是等于呢这个又没有这个 antibiotic， 然后又把它限制它蛋白质的这个部分的，那这个等于是有用这个抗生素，然后呢，但是呢没有这个蛋白质的这个限制的时候，然后再来是有抗生素，然后呢又限制它的这个蛋白质的这个摄取的时候呢，可以看到就是它的这个等于呢在没有这个抗生素跟这个没有蛋白质限制的时候呢，那可以看到呢，就是它等于是growth hormone 呢是比较低的，所以 growth hormone 的这个 receptor 的这个表现，它的这个 mRNA 的这个表现呢就比较低的，那这个其在里面的 IGF-1 会比较低，但是呢，这个因为它的这个 IGF-1 比较低，所以呢，它就要去制造大量的这个 IGF-1 的这个 receptor，所以可以看到呢，它就等于呢，在这个有限制的这个时候里面呢，它的这个等于呢就是要去赶快呢制造更多的这个 IGF-1 的 receptor 来抓更多的 IGF-1，才能够让它的这个表现回来，所以整个的这个 mRNA 的变化情况是这样子，OK。
And then again, if you look at the muscles during this restricted phase, of course, the skeletal muscles can respond by making more IGF-1 receptors or by making more growth hormone receptors. But as long as IGF-1 levels, plasma levels are low because the liver is producing low levels, it will have no effect on the reduced.
那么我们再来看一下这个右边上面这个呢，就是其实它就是骨骼里面的，就骨骼肌里面的肌肉里面的这个 IGF-1 或是这个 IGF-1 receptor 的这些表现的这个情况那么当我有把它限制它的这个蛋白质的这个过程里面的话呢，前面也可以看到呢，就是它的这个growth hormone 会比较低呢 ，IGF-1 会比较低。然后它要去大量制造它的这个 IGF-1 的这个 receptor， 那一样呢，在这个阶段里面的话呢，它如果有做蛋白质限制的时候呢，它 IGF-1 的这个receptor 的这个生成量呢就要比较大。
Now this is the realimentation phase, and then during the realimentation phase, again you see that the amount of growth hormone receptors is increased significantly compared to the restricted phase. And then, of course, again, IGF-1 production is increasing. And look at the levels, for instance. Here, growth hormone release, this is compared 3 to, let's say here, less than 1. This is a 6-fold increase in growth hormone receptors. And for instance, here, you see almost 6-fold increase in IGF-1 levels, which of course results in higher IGF-1 levels in the skeletal muscles, and therefore growth is increased.
那么在正常阶段下面来看就正常阶段，你如果说它尤其是对这个蛋白质呢，它有一些限制来供给的时候呢，可以看到呢，它就是说它的这个growth hormone 的这个 receptor， 它的这个表现呢，会比前面的这个限制，等于是在不足的这个限制的这个阶段里面的时候呢，它要明显的这个增加然后呢，它的 IGF-1 的生成呢也会比较多，所以当给它很正常的时候呢，它的 growth hormone 的 receptor 这多以后呢，它就促进它肝脏里面多增加 IGF-1 的分泌，多增加 IGF-1 的这个分泌以后呢，就可以看到右手边呢，它的骨骼肌里面的这个 IGF-1 的量就会比较多这样的话呢，它就能够让它的蛋白质这个沉积呢跟成长呢就会比较好OK。
Again, this was a trial after weaning, where, via nutrient restriction, we try to manipulate IGF-1 levels. Now I'll show you a trial where it was done during the suckling period, where either an adequate level of nutrients was given during the suckling period or an increased level, a high nutrient level. And this was done an increase of 50% intake of nutrients by feeding milk replacers.
好，那么前面那一个表的话呢，是做在这个保育阶段以后，也就是说在生长前期的是20公斤以后的这个情况。那这个试验里面呢，就把它做在是什么？就是刚出生的这个小猪啊。那么在这个刚出生的这个小猪里面呢，它做一个就是我有给它这个营养的限制的，或者是说给它这个低营养的这个产品，还有一个呢是给它高的这个营养的这个情况里面的话呢，那么它的这个整个的变化的这个情况啊 ，OK。
And of course, you'll be very proud because this is another Chinese researcher, and he was looking at the effect of the adequate nutrition with piglets born with very low birth weight, so intrauterine growth restriction. These piglets were only 870 grams at birth, or normal birth weight piglets, which were 1.5 kilo at birth.
那么这个呢，也是因为是中国的这个一个作者哈，在这个整个的这个中国的这边的这个研究的报告哦，也可以看到，那么它其实就把它分成了是这个 IUG 跟这个正常体重的这个小猪哈，那么就是说宫内发展迟滞的这个小猪的话，比如说它出生的体重只有0.87公斤，然后正常体重是在1.52公斤。然后用这两种不同体重的小猪呢，然后他给它高营养、低营养的这个比较的情况啊 ，OK。
And of course, what you would expect is that these piglets that were light at birth also would be light at weaning. But if you increase the nutrient level, then of course both the light piglets would increase, in this case 26% in weight gain, and also the piglets of normal birth weight also would increase their weight gain with about 25%.
那么这个就可以看到，就是说，当我出生的体重如果越小，它当然断奶的体重是会比较低的。但是呢，我出生的体重万一比较小的时候呢，如果我给它高的营养，哦，也就是我们像现在我们就给它很多的这个代奶料，那么它其实呢，就是可以让它的这个断奶体重呢是增加很多的哦。就比如说这个是这个出生比较弱小这个的话呢，它可以比它原本的这个体重呢要增加到多26%。哦，那如果是比较正常的这种体重的小猪的话呢，它也可以让它的增重差不多多25%出来。OK。
Like I said, these piglets were lighter to begin with, so they were lighter at weaning. But what is interesting, if you look at the fractional weight gain, so the weight gain divided by the birth weight, then you actually see that the fractional weight gain of these piglets is much higher than the piglets of normal birth weight. And even if you supply them more nutrients, the fractional weight gain during the suckling period of these light piglets is higher, which means that these piglets are born small, but they have a tremendous potential for weight gain if they are fed high levels of nutrient during the lactation period.
好，那么这个再来看一看它是所谓的这个fractional 的这个 gain 呢，也就是说它的这个主要的话呢，就是说让它的这个增重除以它的这一个出生重这个比值。那这个增重除以出生重的这个比值以后呢，比如说它在低营养浓度的这个状态里面就5.34跟3.85倍。那么但是呢，万一我的小猪生出来是比较小的时候呢，我给它高营养浓度，给它早期的这个好的这个营养的时候呢，它其实增加的倍数是可以增加非常多的，尤其是在这个弱小猪的话呢，是可以增加到6.75倍啊，就多增加26%。然后呢，这个正常的小猪呢，也可以增加到4.83倍啊，所以都增加了25%啊。OK。
Of course, these intrauterine growth restricted piglets during this latter part of the gestation period, they had less nutrients supplied via the uterus, and it resulted in less muscle development. And that's why you see that the cross section, for instance, of this muscle psoas the psoas major was lower, and also the amount of microfibers was lower. Nevertheless, with a higher level of nutrients, you can see you can increase this muscle development. So that's one of the reasons why, in general, intrauterine growth restricted piglets will have less lean meat, but one of the opportunities, if you want a window of opportunity to increase it, is again during the lactation period.
那么我们知道呢，这些IUGR 的这个小猪呢，最主要呢，它是因为母猪的这个供应到子宫里面的这个营养是不足的，造成呢它的这个小猪呢就发育迟滞。那所以可以看到呢，它的这一个整个肌肉的这一个横切面的这个表面积来看的话呢，如果是 IUGR 跟这一个这个正常体重来比的时候呢，就 IUGR 的这一个肌肉的横切面的这个面积呢都会比较少。比较小，那另外呢，来看到它的这个肌纤维的这个数量里面来看的话呢，也可以看到这些弱小的 IUGR 的这个小猪呢，它本身的这一个肌纤维数量呢都会比较低，但是呢，就远低于它正常体重的这些。但是呢，当我把它的这个营养浓度拉高，然后呢，在它这个泌奶的这个阶段，或者哺乳的这个阶段，我给它高的营养浓度的时候呢，它可以让它的这个肌肉、这个肌纤维素，或者是说它的这个整个后面里面的这个摄入率呢，是可以提升的。也就是说，这个阶段如果给它高营养，那么它对它后面的这个体组成，尤其是蛋白质合成呢，还是有帮忙的。OK。
So you see, the higher fractional gain of these piglets, these intrauterine growth restricted piglets, and you also see when you give a high nutrient level that the mRNA expression for muscle development is increased. So again, the whole point of it is specifically piglets who are lacking behind in growth, small piglets, intrauterine growth restricted piglets, those you can increase the most by increasing IGF-1 levels or nutrient levels during the lactation period.
那么所以可以看到哈，就是说以它的这个 IUGR 的这个在低营养浓度的时候呢，它的这个体重的这个增加的倍数啊，就增重的这个跟体重的增加倍数呢，相比到我给它高营养浓度的时候呢，就可以看到呢，它的这个倍数呢是增加的，也就是说表示说它的这个整个蛋白质的合成呢，就是 RNA 的这个数量来看的话呢，它是增加的，就显著的增加。那么这中间也就可以表示说，万一我的这个出生的弱小猪，如果能够在出生或在哺乳阶段里面，我给它呢这些营养的这个补充的话呢，是可以让这些小猪呢以后的这个整体的生长，还有它的这个蛋白质合成都能够补偿回来。OK。
So here they looked in the muscle in the psoas major at the levels of different products. For instance, here is mTOR, the gene expression of mTOR. mTOR is the mammalian target of rapamycin, and these are kinases. These are kinases that are involved with energy and protein synthesis in response to IGF-1. So you clearly see that the mTOR and the, for instance, the protein kinase B levels are lower in the intrauterine growth restricted piglets than in normal birth weight piglets. But you also see that if you increase the nutrient level with 50%, both in the intrauterine growth restriction levels, the mTOR expression is higher, as well as that it is also in normal birth weight piglets.
那么我们再来看一下就是它的这个整个 mRNA 的这个表现的情况哈。那 mTOR 的话呢，就主要是跟它的这个乳腺里面的这一个整个的基因表现有关系的也就是它的很多的这些蛋白质的这个形成的这一些因子的部分的那这个AKT 的话呢，主要是在免疫里面的就很多的这些免疫系统的这些肠道的这些免疫系统的这些分泌的细胞的就是这些蛋白质的部分的一个变化情况。 那可以看到，就是说，当我的这一个整个呢，如果是说出生来的这个弱小猪跟正常体重的，那我给它低营养浓度的时候呢，它都是跟不上给它产后给高营养浓度的。所以呢，看起来啊，怎么样能够在这个小猪哺乳的这个阶段里面，怎么样能够提供它这个 IGF-1？那么事实上呢，是可以让它的这个以后的蛋白质表现，还有整个猪的这个生长呢，是可以做很大幅度的提升的哦。OK。
When we looked at the results from you, we looked at the liver, now we look at the muscle, and you see the same effect. When there is intrauterine growth restriction, there is less growth hormone receptors, and as a consequence to that, there is less IGF-1 production, and there is also less IGF-1 receptors on the muscle.
那么也可以看到呢，就是说，如果是我这个一般的这个出生，如果是弱小的猪呢，它的这不管是它的 IGF-1 的 receptor， 或者是说它的 growth hormone 的 receptor 呢，它都是比较低的。哦，那这中间如果是我在这一些弱小猪里面呢，很快速的能够给它提供这些 IGF-1 的话呢，应该对它的后续里面是表现是有很大帮忙啊。OK。
And with a higher nutrient level, we're not so much increasing growth hormone receptors, but with a higher nutrient level, we're increasing IGF-1 receptors, and as a consequence, more binding of IGF-1, and therefore an increase in growth.
那么虽然这个产后给它高营养的这些小猪呢，它的这个growth hormone 的 receptor 的这个量呢没有比较高，但是可以看到它 IGF-1 的这个 receptor 量呢是很大速的快速的提升。这大量这个提升以后呢，它可以吸收更多的这个 IGF-1， 可以结合更多 IGF-1， 它这个对它的整个 IGF-1 的这个影响是很大的帮忙。OK。
Again, some research from China, but this time looking at the ileum, so in the small intestine, and this was done a growth restriction where postnatal growth restriction basically meant that piglets were selected that only gained about 70% of what the normal piglets had gained in 42 days.
那么这个一样是中国大陆的这个研究报告哈。那么这个呢，就是对这一些等于是出生以后呢生长迟缓的这些小猪哈，也就是说它的这个做它42日龄的时候呢，它回肠里面的 IGF-1 跟这个 growth hormone 的 receptor 跟这个 mRNA 的这个整个表达的情况。OK。
And again, you see that when there is an postnatal growth restriction, growth hormone receptors are down in the ileal mucosa, as well as IGF-1 levels are lower too.
那么可以看到呢，就是这些生长激素的这个等于呢它是比较抑制的，或是说它限制的这个情况里面的话呢，它的 IGF-1 或者是说它的这个 growth hormone 的 receptor 呢，就可以看到是比较明显的低的。
And then what they also found is, for instance, if you look at the pro-inflammatory cytokines, so interleukin-1b, interleukin-6, interleukin-8, TNF-alpha, for instance, all those were increased. So here you see, for instance, interleukin-1b, interleukin-8, and here interleukin-6, the TNF-alpha, which was not significantly decreased then. But these pro-inflammatory cytokines are causing damage to basically the tight junctions, so that more toxins are absorbed in the gut. And that's for instance, the reason that you also see that when these pro-inflammatory cytokines are increased, it's not only that gut development is decreased, but also that, for instance, feed intake is decreased. And that's the reason why these piglets gained about 70% of what normal piglets did because of a low feed intake.
那么再来看一下呢，就是说它的这个生长迟滞的这一个小猪呢，在42日龄里面的话呢，去测它的这种各种这个发炎的这个刺激素哈，就是等于是这个等于像这个 IL-1然后 IL-6了 IL-8了哈，就是 TNF-alpha 这一些来看的话， 都可以看到呢，如果说这一些小猪如果是生长比较慢的时候，它发炎指数都比较高。那它发炎指数比较高的时候呢，它就一直在产生炎性反应，所以呢，就会让它是怎么样？会产生肠道呢就不健康，就产生肠漏的这个现象。也就是说，它的这个胎浆群呢就没有办法结合很好，然后呢就肠漏。肠漏以后的话呢，肠道发育就不健全，肠道发育不健全的时候呢，就变成是什么？它的采食量呢也就下降。OK.
So let's look at how IGF-1 can increase gut barrier function or can, for instance, decrease leaky gut syndrome.
那么我们来看一下，就是说呢，这个 IGF-1 它主要跟这个肠道的屏障功能，还有它的这个紧密结合的这个影响是怎么样的啊 ？OK.
Of course, the first line of defense in the gut barrier function is the mucus that's laying on top of the microvilli. And for instance, the mucus is produced by the goblet cells, and IGF-1 is having an influence on the mucus production by these goblet cells, and therefore is increasing gut barrier function.
那么我们知道呢，这个前面的这个肠道里面的话呢，在肠道的这个表皮细胞上面的话呢，是所谓的这个黏膜。这个黏膜的这个分泌的话呢，黏膜的分泌主要是杯状细胞的这个分泌那这个杯状细胞的这个分泌的话呢，它要去分泌这些黏膜的时候呢，它主要呢就是受到等于是像这个 IGF-1 的这些影响OK.
And this mucus prevents pathogenic bacteria, for instance, from colonization, adhering to the epithelium, and therefore cause damage to the tight junctions. Here's why you see the tight junctions in between the cells. So the tight junctions are more or less the cement that keeps the cells together, and they have an important function in providing a good barrier function.
那么我们知道呢，因为这个黏膜的话呢，它主要是对抗了，等于是这个黏膜的这个屏障呢，主要它能够预防呢这些有害菌呢，它粘着到这个上皮细胞里面来但是呢，如果说我的这个黏膜分泌不足的时候呢，那么呢，它的这个有害菌呢就跑到这个等于是黏膜细胞上层那开始呢就会产生了分泌一些可能呢。像内乳素啦什么这些的话呢，就让它的这个肠道里面的这个我们叫紧密结合紧密结合里面的话，它有一个紧密结合蛋白。那紧密结合蛋白呢，它如果是 IGF-1 不够的时候，紧密结合蛋白呢就分泌也不足，然后呢就产生了这个成为肠漏的这个现象。所以呢，这个有害菌呢就很容易通过它的这个柱状细胞这边的这个应该要紧密结合的这个产生漏洞以后呢，就跑到血液里面去OK。跑到肠道里面，这个内皮里面，然后就跑到这个血液里面去OK.
Because when these tight junctions are, let's say, less functional, then of course pathogenic bacteria can migrate here into the lamina propria, and in this region is where the GALT-associated lymphoid tissue is active. And then cytokines are produced, the pro-inflammatory cytokines, what I was talking about, for instance, earlier. They, of course, stimulate the immune response, therefore cause inflammation in the gut. But besides causing inflammation, also free radicals are produced, and they further break down these tight junctions, and therefore result ultimately in diarrhea and less gut development.
那么知道这些有害细菌呢，它如果是经由这个因为肠漏这个紧密结合这个疏散以后呢，然后它就跑到这个等于是肠道的内层来，内层来以后呢，就引起很多的这些免疫反应那引起免疫反应的这个过程里面的话呢，那么它呢本身这个发炎的指数呢，就从这几个发炎的这一个指标呢，就从这里面的话呢会增生。第二个部分呢，它也产生很多的自由基，自由基呢又来破坏到它的这个紧密结合所以呢，让它的这一个整个的肠道呢，就因为这一个整个呢，因为肠漏，所以呢造成了就后续影响的这些腹泻啦，或是很多的这个肠道的问题OK。
So there's 3 levels that are important. The mucus that's produced by, let's say, goblet cells, etc. The integrity of the cell membranes, which is caused by the tight junctions. And the 3rd level of defense is the immune response. And all those 3 are influenced by IGF-1.
所以 IGF-1 呢就影响到这3层哈，第一层的话呢是黏膜的这个黏膜层哦，黏膜的话呢从杯状细胞里面要分泌这些黏膜的时候呢，就需要做 IGF-1 的这个控制。第2个部分呢就是紧密结合的，就是等于上皮细胞的这个部分。那么上皮细胞的这个紧密结合的部分的话呢，它也跟这个等于是跟 IGF-1 呢是有相关。那万一如果是产生肠漏以后呢，到肠道的这个内壁里面。然后呢，到血管之间的话呢，在这个产生了就很多的这些炎性的这个反应哦。那炎性反应的这一些过程里面的话呢，那么它本身呢也受到 IGF-1 的这个也有 IGF-1 呢也是有相关联的哦。OK。
And therefore, looking at the relation between gut microbiota and IGF-1, I've here some research from C again from 2021. And this is looking at germ-free piglets versus normal piglets and then fecal supplemented piglets. And then we're going to look at the different hormone levels.
那么另外呢也可以看到呢，这个也是今年很新的一个报告哦，就是中国的这个报告来看的话，它就分析了这个小猪在无菌或者正常小猪，或者是说呢它只是从这个粪便里面呢来接触这个整个的它的这个对它的这个 growth hormone 或是 IGF-1 的生成，还有它的这个增生跟分化的这个影响啊。
So you see in germ-free piglets, you have lower levels of growth hormone, and also you have lower levels of IGF-1. And part of the reason of these levels are lower is because of the lower gut development and the lower barrier function of the gut, so that you get more problems with, let's say, tight junctions that are leaking, etc.
那么因为可以看到就无菌的这个情况里面的这个小猪哈，如果说它这个肠道的这个里面呢没有很好的这些微生生物的这个菌虫的话，在无菌状态里面的话呢，它的这个等于呢它的这个肠道的这些屏障啊，不管它的这个黏膜啦，或者是说它的这个上皮各方面的这些屏障的这个功能呢就比较差。所以呢，可以看到它的这个生长荷尔蒙，或者是说它的这个 IGF-1 的这个整个生成也会比较差哦。所以这个是在无菌状态里面呢，其实它的肠道呢是不健康的哦。OK。
And then again, you see that if you look at, for instance, mTOR, like we did here before, or IGF-1 receptors on the muscles of these piglets, that was decreased too, and therefore you see less muscle fiber development, specifically of the larger muscles, which is then very visible here in these results, these pictures that are shown here.
那么也可以看到呢，就是说它的这个如果是在无菌状态里面的话呢，其实它各种的这个细胞的这些增生呢，或者是说它的这个蛋白质的这个生成的这一些因子来看的话呢，其实都比较差哦。不管它的是 mTOR 啦，或者是说它的 IGF-1 的这个 receptor 啦，还有呢到它的这一个整个的肌肉的这一个分布的这个大小来看的话呢，就无菌的状态里面呢，它其实是细胞的增生跟分裂呢是不好的。
So the point of it is gut health is also influencing IGF-1 levels and is influencing muscle proliferation and development.
那么也就可以导演出就是说什么，其实我们讲的肠道健康，也就是说肠道的这个微生物哈，就 microbiota 的部分呢，它必须呢是很正常。很正常的情况里面呢，它会影响到生长激素跟 IGF-1 的这个量，然后呢，这个 IGF-1 跟生长激素的这个量，或者它的 receptor 呢，就可以影响到它整个这一头猪里面的后续里面的肌肉生长。OK。
So to summarize it, IGF-1 increases gut development and strengthens the tight junctions, so you have less leaky gut and less absorption of endotoxins, basically the biogenic amines as well as the xenobiotics, for instance, the mycotoxins, so you get an increased nutrient absorption, which of course will improve growth and FCR.
所以呢，就 IGF-1 呢，它会促进肠道的这个发育而且强化它的这个肠道里面的这个紧密连接所以呢，它会减少所谓的肠漏症还有这个像一些内毒素像尤其呢像生物胺或者是这一些外源性的这个物质，像霉菌毒素的这些吸收那么增加它整体的营养的这个吸收。
Which means you have an improved liver function. Of course, the liver plays an important role in detoxification, as well as also in the metabolism, the energy metabolism, the protein deposition, and therefore will improve growth and milk production, for instance.
那么当然呢，它也可以就是什么样改善肝脏的功能，因为肝脏呢最主要有一个解毒的功能，还有一个新陈代谢的功能因为它的这个新陈代谢以后呢，就可以维持呢，让我们这个动物维持正常采食量，还有呢它的这个生长像蛋白质的沉积的这个糖类的这个碳水化合物的分解那么怎么样能够长得更好还有这个像产乳量的这些泌奶的这个部分都受到整个肝脏功能的这个影响，那 IGF-1 呢就可以改善了肝脏的功能。OK。
IGF-1 also increases the insulin sensitivity, so the glucose uptake by the gut as well as the reproductive organs, especially glucose uptake by the gut is very important with the piglets right after birth, so that during the suckling period you get a good gut development. But also, for instance, in the reproductive organs, specifically the latter phase of the gestation period, and therefore, for instance, preventing intrauterine growth restriction and low birth weight piglets.
那么IGF-1 呢，它也会增加肠道跟生殖器官呢它的这个胰岛素的敏感性，而且呢，它胰岛素的敏感性一增加以后呢，它对整个葡萄糖的吸收呢就有帮忙。那么这个葡萄糖的这个吸收有帮忙以后的话呢，就对它的整个的，尤其是在小猪的这个早期的肠道的发育呢，它就很大的这个帮忙。第二个部分呢，就是对于这一个整个的怀孕后期的这些母猪的话呢，那么它的这个葡萄糖的这个吸收利用会比较好的时候呢，那么它本身这个以后的泌奶还有它的这个产奶量会比较多。第三个呢，当然就是在这一个断奶以后这些小母猪的话呢，如果说它葡萄糖的吸收利用会比较好的时候呢，那么它本身呢对它的这个生殖系统里面，尤其生殖细胞的这些发育呢，也有很大的帮忙OK。
IGF-1 also, again, because it stimulates the glucose uptake, it stimulates lactose production and therefore milk production. But also via the milk, if you have a higher milk production, more IGF-1 from the sow, from the plasma of the sow, is of course transferred to the piglets, and this increases the gut development during nursing.
那么 IGF-1 呢，它也会增加乳腺对这个葡萄糖的吸收跟它的这个整个利用所以呢，它的这个奶里面的这个量它的泌奶量高以外呢，它的这个 IGF-1 会比较高，所以呢，这些小猪呢喝了这些母奶以后呢，它本身的这个 IGF-1 就会比较高，所以喝的母奶越多的时候呢，这个小猪的肠道呢就受到 IGF-1 高的这个影响，所以它发育就会更好所以这个小猪以后的肠道呢就更健康OK。
And again, like I was saying, IGF-1 is needed for the amino acid and the glucose uptake in the muscles, and therefore it can improve lean growth, but specifically, of course, what you see, it's improving FCR.
那么IGF-1 当然也可以增加就是我们肌肉里面的这个葡萄糖的使用所以呢，它可以提高我们的这个瘦肉增长所以并且呢提高就是改善我们的这个 FCR OK。
And last but not least, the gut-brain axis, because IGF-1 is having such a strong influence on gut health. Via improving gut health, it can, of course, improve also the production of, for instance, other hormones like growth hormone, influence, for instance, insulin insulin production, and therefore have a strong influence on growth for the body as a whole.
那么当然知道，就是前面也谈到，就 IGF-1它跟肠道健康是有很大关系所以呢，肠道健康现在所谓的这个肠脑轴就是肠道健康以后呢，它脑部里面所分泌的这个整个的后续里面影响的这一些荷尔蒙的分泌呢，就会在正常所以等于呢，它的这一些分泌一正常以后呢，它就可以又让它的这个肠道里面可以分泌更多的这个胰岛素或是 IGF-1以后，然后呢这些肠脑轴的作用就让它的这一个动物里面以后的表现或是繁殖的部分呢，就能够更正常。OK.
Now, of course, IGF-1 doesn't stand alone. You always need to take this in consideration with other nutritional management. For instance, making sure you got enough pre-starter feed intake before weaning, trying to increase sow feed intake during the lactation period, as well as having enough protein and essential amino acids for growth. But that speaks for itself.
那么当然呢，就除了 IGF-1的供应以外呢，要其他的营养分供应呢，也必须要相互结合比如说像这个母猪的这个泌奶泌奶要让它增加的时候呢，就等于呢是在泌奶之前，等于在分娩之前的时候呢，怎么样让它的这个 IGF-1能够增加，然后它摄取的蛋白质也能够增加，或者是说呢，在小猪的这个在哺乳的阶段出生以后的话，怎么样能够提供它除了母奶以外的母奶要能够更多的这些 IGF-1的来源以外呢，然后再提供更多的这些营养，让它在这个小猪的阶段里面呢，也能够有更多的这个 IGF-1生成，然后它的肠道呢就会更健康，然后它就长得更好OK.
Then last but not least, here are some practical results that were done with some Lianol trials. Some of it from 17 kilograms into slaughter, or 25, 28 kilograms slaughter, or during the growing period. And basically the main thing that you see, of course, is that the strongest effect was on FCR, reducing FCR. And for instance, that's also related to the length or the time period that you are feeding it, because here FCR, for instance, was improved less than during these trials.
那么这个来看一下就是说在利安诺产品它本身呢，在中国、在荷兰、在比利时这些呢，最中大猪里面测试里面的这个成绩，实际上现场的成绩来看那中国的话呢，是测53到78公斤的时候呢，它是日增重增加 2.6， 然后 FCR 是改善超 1.5。但是呢，可以看到荷兰、比利时这边的话呢，它最主要呢，这个 FCR 的改善呢，其实是非常多的也就是说呢，它 FCR 的可以改善了4到5个百分比是改善非常多，而且呢，它看起来瘦肉率呢也会比较增加那这个 FCR 改善当然就是增重会好，然后这个采食呢不会太多所以呢。那可以看到呢，那有的是可能是增重的，真正的就会好蛮多的所以呢，也可以看到它这个 ADG 的话呢，可以从 2.6 一直到 4.3这个增加所以这个也可以印证，就是说它在中大猪里面呢，它其实是有蛮好的这个效果OK.
Specifically, if the Lianol is fed during the latter phases of the growing period, so let's say after PD max, then you also see more an effect on carcass quality. And again, therefore, the idea is that it's supporting more protein metabolism, especially during the phase when insulin resistance is happening, which again is mostly happening with barrows, more so than with gilts, and is happening during the latter phases of the growing period.
那么这个阶段里面来看的话呢，其实他的这个个人更建议呢，就是说呢，他对于中大猪的这个，尤其是后期的时候，当他的这个蛋白质沉积已经超过他的这个最大沉积量的时候呢，它的影响就更大因为这个时间里面的话呢，一般来看的话，它 IGF-1 的量呢，或者生长荷尔蒙的量呢，都会比较低。那如果说我们额外补充它这个 IGF-1 在这些阉公猪或者是说在生长后期的话呢， 它对它的这个瘦肉率的改善，还有它的这个增重，还有料肉比的改善其实是可以起到很好的效果OK。
So the effect of IGF-1 will be largest on gut health, which is of course most important in the period, let's say, right after weaning, when gut health is most compromised. And of course, it depends a lot on your circumstances. If you're having problem farms, the effect of Lianol will probably be larger. And also the effect of Lianol on, let's say, the protein metabolism and the lean growth. You might expect more of a result, for instance, when the quality of the pigs, the genetics, is better than when it is lower.
那么可以看到呢，就是说利安诺呢，它在小猪的这个阶段尤其是前期来看的话，它 FCR， 那 FCR 的改善呢，最主要的话呢，是因为它肠道健康的这个改善那后期里面来看的话呢，就最主要对它的这个瘦肉比例因为尤其呢在一些呢这个环境比较差的猪场，或是说呢它的这个猪呢是比较早熟品种的，它的瘦肉率成绩是比较少，这个就表示呢它本身 IGF-1 或者生长荷尔蒙是比较低的这个情况，那么它补充给它的这个利尔诺，或者是给它 IGF-1 的时候呢，它可以达到很好的这个效果OK。
So last then, the Lianol potential. What is the window of opportunity to use Lianol? Well, first of all, when you look at the piglet during the suckling period, it can first of all pre-farrowing already when you use it there with the sow and trying to increase colostrum quality, and then in the transition period, for instance, where the colostrum uptake can be influenced. Yes.
OK， 那么可以看到，就是说利尔诺它这个整个使用的这个潜能呢有几个阶段第一个阶段就是利尔诺增加 IGF-1 自母猪转移到仔猪的，也就是说呢，母猪如果在母猪的这个衔接期或者在母猪的泌乳期里面，它使用以后呢，它可以让它奶里面的这个 IGF-1 比较多。那 IGF-1 比较多的话呢，它过渡到就是经由奶然后给小猪以后呢，刚刚也谈到，那么它小猪里面的早期的肠道发育呢，就有很大的帮忙。那这样的话呢，它就这个整个的让它的这个母猪的产奶量会比较好以外呢，就小猪的生长还有小猪的这个肠道健康呢都会比较好OK。
And of course, during the lactation period, you're looking at the transfer of IGF-1 from the sow to the piglet. That's of course related to milk production and content. And the main thing is what you're trying to do, of course, is increase gut development. And especially, again, for low birth weight piglet, this is very important.
那么当然了他谈到也刚刚有在谈，就是说他这个IGF-1 呢，它促进母猪的这个泌奶所以从这个母猪的这个泌奶等于分娩前的这个过渡期开始以后呢，如果能够提供它这个 IGF-1 的这些产品，那让它 IGF-1 提高以后呢，它这个乳汁泌奶多，然后呢给小猪的这个吃的比较多的这个 IGF-1 以后呢，它本身小猪的这个肠道发育会比较好，尤其呢是对这些弱小猪来看。那么它的这个帮忙就更大OK。
Lianol improves the gut barrier function and development. So post weaning, under heat stress conditions, for instance, or on problem farms, that's probably why I want to use the Lianol.
那么另外呢，就肠道这个利安诺呢会增加肠道的这个屏障功能跟发育跟肠道的发育所以呢最佳的这个使用时机，比如说像这个热紧迫的这个时段，或者是说断奶的这个前后，那么还有呢，就是它等于有一些猪场它卫生管理是不好的时候呢，它其实呢或者是疾病爆发以后的话呢，它本身猪的这个摄取都是比较差，或者是说呢它本身的这个肠道都比较不健康的时候呢，给它 IGF-1 是可以做到很快速的一个补充OK。
IGF-1 improves feed conversion ratio and average daily gain. So probably why you want to use it is in the finishing phase, because again, that's where you have more problems with the fat deposition. Use it with barrows, because barrows will have a higher fat deposition than gilts, and also with high energy diets, because high energy diets might provoke glucose resistance.
那么另外呢，就是利昂诺呢，它可以改善 FCR 跟这个日增重 所以如果是育肥猪，它的这个大于75公斤以后呢，我们看到它天然里面呢，它蛋白质合成是比较少。那如果这个时段里面我们给它这个IGF-1，其实呢，也就是它生长荷尔蒙的表现呢会比较好，它的肌肉生长，还有呢细胞的增殖呢就会比较好哦，分裂生殖会比较好，所以呢它有助于呢蛋白质的这个沉积哈，所以这个是这个育肥猪的这个中后期，尤其是在阉公猪里面哦，阉公猪里面我们又怕它太肥，然后呢又怕它的这个后期里面的这个增重呢会下降的时候呢，它其实呢是有比较好的这个帮忙。第三个部分呢，就是等于呢有很多高能量的饲料哦，它有一些蛋白质这个葡萄糖抗性的这些问题的时候呢，那么也可以用利尔诺呢来改善这些情况啊。OK。
And if you want to use Lianol to improve muscle development and lean meat, depends a lot on your market circumstances. If your payment system, like in Europe, is based on lean meat, then of course it could be advantageous, or like you're saying, if barrows are sold via auctions. But it also depends a lot on genetics, because if you have early maturing genetics, or if you're using barrows, then probably the advantages of Lianol are larger than when you're having, let's say, when you're raising boars or later maturing pigs with a higher lean growth.
那么另外呢，就利尔诺它改善肌肉发育跟瘦肉比例哈，那这个中间里面的话呢，尤其呢像欧洲他们因为用土体计价，瘦肉率高呢，它的价钱就比较高，或者像台湾，我们即使是用拍卖活体拍卖来看，如果说这一头公猪它的阉公猪它的这个瘦肉率是比较高，然后它的这个背标是比较薄的时候呢，它售价也会比较高，所以呢。是很值得呢，是能够来在后期里面怎么样来修缮它体型，然后让它的这个瘦肉比例能够增加哦。那这个利尔诺的这个使用呢，尤其对一些早熟的品种，也就是说它的品种如果是越肥的越比较肥胖这个肥肉型的，那么它的这个效果呢就会更好。或者是像这个阉公猪呢，它吃得多，然后能量都过度的这个情况里面的话，那么它可以来改善调整它的这个整个蛋白质的形成这个看起来是有很大帮忙OK。
Now with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. I hope you're still as alert as these piglets are.
OK。